And it's on, man. It's on.
Yo,
The
I always
status
hate.
versus the anti-status. I absolutely love it. Going to be a battle royale, a fight to the death, just so that everybody knows. Well, not, figuratively a fight to the death, right? I don't mean that literally, but just so everybody knows, we do take moderation here seriously, right? We're going to bring out each one of our guests. We're going to allow them to introduce themselves. We're going to allow them to talk about their channel. You see, my Kylo Ren sweatshirt is on, so we know that there's going to be some evil shit afoot. Have the old logo, so you know there's some evil shit afoot. We're going to start with last username. Let's bring him out, Pedro.
Last username. What's up, man?
Yeah, how you doing, man?
How's it going?
Yeah, you want to shout out your channel? Tell everybody where they can find you.
You can find me on Twitch as last_username, or very soon on YouTube as Econarchy. Empty channel right now, but videos are going up soon.
I like
Oh, yeah.
Econarchy. And then Fabian Liberty will be your partner for tonight's debate. Let's bring out Fabian. How you doing, Fabian? It's nice to see you here tonight.
Yeah, I'm doing back. Fabian Liberty is the channel. Scott is the name. Anarcho-capitalism. You can find us on YouTube.
And we've got, of course, returning to the Crucible, CounterPoints. Nice to see you tonight, CounterPoints. CounterPoints was not able to join us by camera tonight because he's a piece of shit. Shout out your channel, CounterPoints, to everyone where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find my piece of shit ass on YouTube at CounterPoints. You can also find me on Twitch,
Economic Anarchy,
and then Twitter _CounterPoints_. Also, you can just go to CounterPoints.gg, which is the website that has all of my perspectives and all that kind of stuff. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, a law enforcement veteran.
Said the mic is still cutting out,
and I like to fight people about everything all the time. If you're down for that, then it should be a good night.
Right.
Base. Next, let's bring out Rob Noer, long time debater on the Crucible. He's back once again for just a little bit more verbal bloodshed. Rob Noer, shout out your channel. Tell everyone where they can find you.
Yeah, my name's Rob Noer. I'm a populist conservative. It's nice to be debating people that are
all right. I'm just going to cut off the noise
smaller
for
government
tonight.
than me because I'm for small government. So this will be interesting. But you can find me primarily on twitch.tv/Rob Noer, all one word, lowercase, as you see it spelled there. Also, sometimes you can find me on YouTube.
Mark is being quiet,
America
so I just cut the gate
but
off.
I'm banned for a
now,
week
so
because I was talking about the Durham report.
So you might get a little bit of background
elections
noise,
and things like that. YouTube, not a big fan of that sort of
at least
stuff. So we'll
it
keep
won't
that
cut out.
to a minimum tonight. But happy to be here.
And happy to have you. Each debater is going to have a 7-minute opening statement. We'll start with Rob Noer. We'll pass it to last username. From there to CounterPoints, and then Fabian Liberty will be able to go last. The challengers in this are going to be Rob Noer and CounterPoints, so we'll let them open with the cross-examination.
Are they
Rob,
challengers?
if you're open, go ahead.
All right. Thanks so much. Glad to be here. Last username I've been on panels with before. Really enjoyed. Fabian, it's my first time with you, so I'm looking forward to it. And Connor, the champion of the Odyssey games, gave himself a tattoo to win. So honored to be here with the champ himself. So, like I said, it's interesting to debate someone. Let me say this at the outset. I enjoy where last username and Fabian are coming from, because I too think that individual liberty, personal responsibility are the things that make our country great and are things that we should strive for. It was written into the foundational documents of our country, which made this the greatest country in the history of the world. So I sympathize with the idea of trying to maximize individuality, liberty, and things like that. However, the problem's going to be that it's just this idea of anarcho-capitalism is just not doable. It's not practical whatsoever. And it's basically a pipe dream. It's one of those things that you could sit around and talk about on paper in your, in laboratories. And, if you're a weirdo, it debates at the bar instead of sports or something like that. But it's just not practical. It's not able to be done, right? It's something that's just some ideological, masturbation that you could sit around and talk and sound smart, but it's not practical whatsoever, and we'll get into the reasons why.
It's nice.
So we're talking specifically about policing and criminal justice.
Everything
this
about
has to do with their system in general, which would be a system that advocates for basically no state and no laws and no enforcement through the state of laws whatsoever. So the problem with this is going to be that there's not really anything beneficial that comes from it. They'll say the reason for this is to maximize individuality and maximize liberty, and taxation is theft, and laws through the government are infringing upon people and your liberty and things like that. But they're basically just rejecting one form of the state for another. And it'll be a form of the state that'll be less accountable. when you get rid of this sort of state, there's going to be all sorts of problems, which I'll identify some now that I just briefly came up with the top of my head. The first is that this sort of not having a state doesn't work in a society that's as complex as ours. So regardless of what you think, and there are many problems that have to do with too large of a state, and we're constantly need to be pushing back against that. But the reality is we need a state for base necessities such as policing, such as small infrastructure things, such as military and things like that, because their idea of a society, it's like you're playing the game Civilization. If you were starting out as an anarcho-capitalist civilization, then maybe you would be able to, in that game, be able to advance. But at the point we're at now, it's not possible. For example, there would be all sorts of questions like who would own the utilities? Who would own, what if a wealthy person says, I now own all the water pipes in this city and no one's allowed to have it unless I tax them at a certain rate, or they pay me money rather than taxes at a certain rate. Same is true of roads and things like that. It's just not feasible. And even though our society has problems, the reality is we live in the best time there is to be alive. Human history has been a history of suffering. When things more akin to anarcho-capitalism would have existed, we were talking about human life being misery, struggling to find the next meal and things like that. Gangs, roving marauders, and things like that would be running the show. So I just think it's too complex now. The second thing would be that it would be a system where wealth makes right. They'll talk about we could factor out things to insurance companies that would resolve disputes, but those insurance companies are still going to have a profit motivation, just like insurance companies do now. And that means the wealthiest people would be able to influence those insurance companies to have outcomes that they wanted. And so you'd still be withheld to a same system. Also, if you don't have the money to pay into that insurance company, then you would be left in the cold. So you still don't have this sort of personal liberty. The third thing is this would be an ethno-nationalist dream. If you're familiar with the Crucible, you've seen that those sorts of people like to rally around the fringes of all sorts of ethno-nationalism. This is be exactly the type of system they would advocate for. They would say, in our area, we control this area, and our system says the insurance companies kick all people of a certain skin color or ethnicity out. That would be disastrous and cause inner conflicts amongst those ethnicities. The fourth would be that it would lead to a tyranny of the mob and gang warfare and things like that. We could get more into it, but you could understand how this would be the case without any laws. If a particular gang in a particular area had the plurality of power, they would basically be that insurance company that would enforce criminal behavior as they saw fit. The fifth would be that there's no more freedom than we have from the state, as I already said, because you're just replacing it with sort of another state, which we can get more into. The sixth would be it only works if the whole world does it. They'll talk a lot about, well, we can't point to a system where this has been done and it works, but that's because the current system doesn't allow it. Well, the reality is the current system would never allow it. If the whole world doesn't change to this mindset at the same time, then what would happen would be you would have one strongman country that would say, oh, sweet, no one has a military anymore. They're now all dependent on picking up the phone and calling each other to have private militias or insurance companies develop mercenaries or something to fight back. It would be a disaster. The seventh would be they'll say these insurance companies will enforce morality, but that morality is going to be subjective to each individual. So each agency would have different opinions of morality, which means that there would be clashes that would occur in between these agencies, which would lead to more violence overall. And the last would be that there'll be all sorts of mandates and things like that. We can see right now that there are many people in this country. At one point, particularly, it's getting better, but that wanted all sorts of crazy things under COVID. For example, 30-something% of Democrats say that your children should be taken away from you if you don't take certain medications and things like that. In the system they're talking about, in the enclaves with the insurance companies that were owned by these particular people, they would be able to enforce those insurance companies going in, removing children and things like that. And there would be nothing you could do about it. So even though there are problems with the state, which I will absolutely agree with, the reality is giving monopoly of enforcement to the state is one of the best things we could do. And it would basically be a system with less individual liberty, more collectivism and things like that if we adopted the sort of anarcho-capitalist mindset that they're saying. It's just not possible. It's an idea that sounds neat to talk about and test in a laboratory and in debates like this. But each of you listening right now knows it's not possible.
Man, that was like right on the nose, man. You were
how
you crammed all of that into your time. I'll never understand. Last username, you're up. You have 7 minutes on the clock. Go ahead.
All right. So that was a pretty comprehensive intro by Rob. Good. It outlined a lot of the concerns that most people have about the idea of a stateless society, and all the concerns that I had when I first became a libertarian. I was a minarchist. I thought, well, it would be the state's not a good thing, but we need it because it would be impractical to do things like law, like police and courts and stuff without a state. And it's totally reasonable to think that if you've never seen such a thing, and you never tried to imagine such a thing, which is not easy to imagine. But I encountered a lot of people who have spent a lot of time imagining how that might work, and they've actually come up with pretty good descriptions of it. And as I read those descriptions and thought about it, I eventually came to the conclusion that this actually could work. There's no particular reason it wouldn't, and it's certainly worth trying. So there's a lot of misconceptions about how a stateless justice system works. First of all, the idea there would be
all right.
Well, first of all of the things that the services that we have
It's
now,
like how
the basic
formal
elements,
debates are done.
Courts to resolve disputes, police
This
to
isn't
enforce your
like
rights,
the blood sports.
and laws to make it clear to everyone what is right and what is wrong and what they're allowed to do. These are all important things that I think are essential. And I think that you can have all of those things without a state. I don't think you need a state to have those things. I think that you can have all of those things provided by a competitive free market, just like the same way we provide most of the other things in society. And I probably don't have to convince the people here that generally free markets are better at providing things than states. Competition, choice, creative destruction. These are the things that make products and services good, that solve problems, that give us this general progress.
No, that's how
technology,
actual debates are done, Sir
improving
Physics
society.
TV.
I think
30
we're all pretty much
seconds
on board
is
on that. And
opening
it's just
statements
a
that
matter
they
of
do
imagining how could you have a
on
market
panels on
provide
Twitch.
justice in that way. So, well, first of all, if you look closely, you see that we actually already do provide things like that. We have private security guards that are kind of like private police, right? They'll protect you to some extent, but they're limited in what they can do. We also have private arbitration agencies that will resolve disputes for you. And they're also limited in what they can do, but we try to use them as much as we can. And you'll also notice that these services tend to be much higher quality than the government provided services, as you might predict, right? You don't hear a lot about security guard brutality. It doesn't, arbitration agencies aren't like prohibitively expensive to use where you have to go bankrupt if you ever end up having to use one. They're good to use to resolve your disputes. People want to use them to resolve the disputes. So if these private companies had more authority if security guards could actually enforce your rights completely, and if arbitration agents could resolve your disputes in a binding way, would this be terrible? Would it cause conflict? Well, some people would say, yeah, sure, because how are they going to decide what the laws are? And if there's a dispute between two people who have different security companies, aren't they just going to get into a war with each other? And it might seem that way at first, but if you think about it, it actually seems pretty unlikely that would really happen. And I don't have time to really explain it in this intro, but I'm sure we'll get into it in the conversation. But as a rough idea, we kind of already have a situation like that in the world, right? We have many nations which have their own legal systems. They have no common authority, no world government that tells them what to do or what the law should be. And yet they have all managed to work out treaties that allow them to get along and not go to war every time someone from one country commits a crime in another one, right? If a Canadian commits a crime in America, Canada and America don't go to war. They have rules for working it out. They have treaties. There's, it's worked out, even though there's no common authority telling them how to do that. Somehow they figure it out. And if you start to think about that, you'll see that can actually work on a much smaller scale. And you could have a society where you could literally choose who enforces your right and who resolves your disputes. And yet those companies wouldn't have to fight with each other, and you would have more or less a common set of laws that everyone follows, or at least everyone would know what laws they're following at any given time. So I think throughout this debate, we'll be going into that and explaining it. And I'm glad that Rob is so curious about this, because I really the key is to just say, instead of saying, I know this can't work, just ask, how would this work? And I am glad to explain it to you and to forward you to other reading where you can learn more details how it works. And I think that's good enough for now. I'll see my time.
Okay, so you cede your time over. Counterpoints, it does not mean that you get more time. It just means you get the same amount of time, and he ceded his. Now, I see this message here. It says, holy shit, wrap it up. Hey, I just want to let you know, fuck you. They got 7 minutes, you prick. All right, Counterpoints, you're up. You got 7 minutes.
Yeah, so one thing that I never really heard in that description was why. And that's my main problem with this entire idea set, is that I think it takes like a fundamental moral axiom, extrapolates it out into the world, and basically gives no real I don't know, like thought to practicality. And then all of the practical externalities that critics talk about is basically dismissed as, oh, well, we'll figure it out, or we'll negotiate these externalities, or we'll do this, or we'll do that. Well, the truth is that we can actually look back through history and see all of the times that perverse incentives have existed in the past, where the profit motive wasn't the best motive. We can understand why public institutions are oftentimes less poorly funded than private institutions, and we can also understand, like, so for instance, like, this is one of the things that kind of stuck out to me really badly. So we've never heard about private security guard brutality. Yeah, we have. We see it all the fucking time. People in bars get bounced and choked out and fucking slammed against the wall and thrown out of bars all the goddamn time. So what are we talking about?
Bold-faced lie. He never made that claim.
Private security guard brutality. Also, the lack of complaints about private security is because they don't have arrest powers, meaning that they don't take on the roles of law enforcement due to limited liability. So a lot of the things, like, I don't know, killing people, throwing them in bracelets, putting them in cages, all of that kind of stuff, are things that private security don't currently do. So acting like they don't get complaints about those things, yeah, that's because they don't perform those services. So that seems weird. Then finally, people are actively choosing to use private arbitration firms and private security. Yeah, people who can afford private security and private arbitration. The reason why you don't hear about, and by the way, you hear plenty of people complaining about the cost of security and the cost of arbitration all the time. Lawyers are arbitrators, and lawyers, just in case anybody forgot, are fucking vampiric administrative bureaucratic dickheads who will basically drag on negotiations for their own personal benefit, so they can take a 30 to 40% of the fucking cut of the administrative negotiations. So to pretend that somebody that you are individually paying to settle a dispute doesn't have some kind of financial incentive to drag out the negotiations, I don't know what fucking planet we're living on, where we're just pretending that as soon as we move everything from public to private, public is bad, private is good, and once we move from public to private, everything will stop being bad and start being good. I have no fucking idea, like, where in reality this is held up. And so my curiosity, Ellie, you and I have had this conversation in the past. I don't necessarily need a logistical explanation about a hypothetical society that could exist in which maybe we would be able to figure out these disputes. What I realistically need is I need a reason why. I need a reason why we're going to do this. And then on top of that, I need an explanation of how the negative externalities that we're bringing up as criticisms of your worldview, how they are preferable to the negative externalities we have currently. And that's kind of where I'm going to be. And I'm just going to explain this right now. If you just go, our system is currently bad, expect me to fucking levy that criticism at you, and also to explain why our current system has bad things, and it has checks on power, and it has historical consensus, and it has like 3,000 years of human history supporting the common law across a variety of nations. So that's where, I see this conversation going. So basically, if you want it to be productive, please tell me why we're doing this and why it's better than what we currently have. And maybe I'll take it a little bit more seriously, and I'll yield my time from there.
That's a yield, and we're going to give all of that yielded time over to our last ANCAP friend. But before we do, if you don't stop grooming your fucking face with that thing, I'm sending my private security company to your house, okay? I'm doing it. Stop grooming your face with that thing. Damn it, Scott. You got 7 minutes on the clock. Go ahead.
In honor of BPF, I will keep doing it. Because go fuck yourself. Anyways, so what I've heard so far from both people is, Rob Noer having a lot of what appear to be sincere questions about all the ways that he's not sure how this system would work. And I would love throughout this debate to get into answering some of those questions and showing you how some of those questions seem to be levied against us, but they're the exact same questions we already have answers to for the state, and the answers aren't very good. And then I heard, I'm sure, CounterPoints had some other things, but he wanted to get into a why. He wants a moral axiom to be brought forward as to why we should change things to begin with. And I'd be happy to do that as well. But first, I'd like to go into a bit of an opening statement that actually deals with, the fucking topic of the debate. Because that appears that both of our conservative friends just ignored the topic because they thought it would be good to just attack anarcho-capitalism. So when talking about policing and when talking about the justice system that supports policing, I think the biggest problem we have when speaking to our right-wing friends and conservatives is there is a mythology that needs to be broken down before we can understand why markets would be able to do these things.
That one there was a violation.
Police officers are these good, honorable men that are protecting us and keeping the streets safe. Sorry, can you close your mic, Rob Noer? Protecting the streets. They're keeping us safe. They're these really good, honorable men with an honorable job. And you have this thin blue line mentality and all of these things, when really what police officers are is they're everyday people who have a job. And we all have jobs, or maybe not some of us terminally online people, but most of us have jobs. It's just a job. And the problem is, the biggest problem with the police system is that we have a monopoly on that job. And that job is a government position. And what the police do is they enforce the laws that the state enacts on its citizens. Supposedly there's some form of democratic process, but I'm sure a lot of our right-wing friends might not like the laws that Democrats want to enforce on us. Well, tough cookie, you lost the election. Or maybe there was election fraud. I don't know. But be it one way or the other, you better fucking follow and obey. And we have this idea that cops won't do bad things, or, BLM brings up racism and things like that. And you go, oh, well, that's just a few bad apples in the bunch. Well, no. Cops are some of the most least honorable people in all of American society. They lack more honor than your average deli worker or your school teacher or your school bus driver or any regular job. They lack honor. And the reason for that is that they are oath breakers. They swore an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. And what we have seen over and over again is that they violate these oaths. They violate the First Amendment oath with free speech zones, with cracking down on protests that are peaceful based upon local politicians and what they do or don't like happening in their city. They violate the Second Amendment regularly. There are so many unconstitutional gun laws that are made in America. And what do? They enforce these laws. They have no problem having a large amount of police interactions and hoping that they find a small bag of weed in connection with a gun so that they can get that collar for another person locked up for felony gun possession because they happen to have, a gram of weed in their car in some place. When it comes to the Fourth Amendment, it is very clear that what the founders of the Constitution of America, what they intended for the United States, and what we currently have with the expansion of the Supreme Court. In so many Supreme Court cases, they have gone over and over and over again. They have rethought the Fourth Amendment in terms of what police can and can't do, in terms of egress, in terms of what is reasonable suspicion, in terms of stop and frisk that they took from things like Terry v. Ohio, in terms of having rights that they shouldn't have in schools and in prisons, what lawful arrests are, motor vehicle exceptions. They added exigent circumstances, plain view doctrine. Over and over and over again. The state has watered down the Constitution and has made it so that police that can't be sued and police unions that can't be sued, and even if you do sue them, all that happens is you get money from your local government, which will then raise taxes on you for the violent or bad behavior of police officers. And the worst case of all is civil asset forfeiture. This is a doctrine that is practiced widely in America, and it is a violation of our Fourth, Fifth, and Eighth Amendment right. And anybody that reads those and sees what civil asset forfeiture is almost certainly has to agree. And this is American police. American police are some of the best police in the world. If we look at UK, people are being locked up for mean tweets. If we look at Australia, they're being locked up because they happen to go to an anti-COVID protest. If we look at Canada, they happen to be beating the shit out of moms and kids and trampling them with fucking horses and lying about it because they happen to say that what the state was doing is wrong. Make no amends about it. Police are agents of the state that just have a job. And the state will do whatever it does and use these mercenary and sellswords against us. What we need is private police. What we need is communities and business owners and a free market of people choosing what policing they want in their communities. And then have those people be liable to being able to be sued when they violate those rights. Unfortunately, that's not what we have. And the cheapest, the most effective, and the best way that we can have our rights not be violated and we can achieve our own civil liberties is to get rid of the state's monopoly on power and violence by using mercenaries of the state to punish us whenever they see fit with whatever the rules they make for us.
Gentlemen, we appreciate the opening statements. I think it set the tone very well for the debate. For FL, since I know, or not FL, I'm sorry, for last username, since I know you haven't been here before, we don't do the mic muting bullshit. We don't do that kind of stuff. We're all adults. We expect you guys to act like adults. We expect you to adhere to what the moderators ask you to adhere to. We may ask clarifying questions as we go. Everything we do is just to keep the conversation on track. I'm going to set this back over to Rob Noer and CounterPoints so that they can begin the cross-examination. Go ahead, gentlemen.
No, I'm talking to right wingers.
Rob, can I really quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So basically, there's about 10,000 things that I could address, but so I don't get distracted. The thing that I was asking for that hopefully we can hone in on is why and how is your alternative better? And I want to give a brief rebuttal. Sorry, 1 second. Just so it's not the ANCAP hour, I want to give you a brief rebuttal really quick. So here's my thing. Civil asset forfeiture. I don't know how privatized police don't basically impound your personal possessions when they're not accountable to other people. Battery, assault, extrajudicial violence, all that kind of stuff. I don't know how poor people who can't afford to sue people who use violence against them, I don't know how they don't become second-class citizens, where basically like vagrants and homeless people just get the shit kicked out of them because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time by private security police, and they're trespassed from the area, and every time they show up, they get the shit kicked out of them. I don't know how all of the negative externalities that you basically brought up aren't made worse by privatization rather than better. Because while you can point out all these bad things, which some I agree and some I don't, there is at least some level of consensus when it comes to assault, battery, murder, theft, burglary, hard drugs, all this kind of shit that we have come up with as far as a consensus. This consensus is not just in the United States, it's across most developed nations. And on top of that, you don't have to believe it. You don't have to believe it at all if you don't fucking want to. But there's plenty of ways in which law enforcement officers fuck up, destroy their careers, destroy their families, and can end up in jail or prison right now. Whereas I don't understand, with all of the negative, I'll shut up in a second. I don't understand in all of the examples that you brought up how privatization doesn't make these problems worse. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think last username, you should totally take it.
Right. So, I mean, you asked why. I think you sort of kind of answered that too. I mean, the reason is there's a lot of problems with the current justice system. It's not hard to imagine how those problems could be solved, but it doesn't seem like there's any progress to getting to those solutions or really any practical mechanism for solving them. And I assume you agree with that there is problems, but you're saying that the problems would be, there's no reason to think they'd be any better with a market system. So let's look at, say, civil asset forfeiture. Could private cops just take your stuff and they're not accountable? Well, no, because you're hiring cops to protect your rights. That's what you're paying them to do. So a private security company or private rights enforcement agency makes money by having a lot of customers. They have customers because the customers choose them instead of someone else. And if they're not providing the thing that the customers are paying for, the customers are going to take their money elsewhere. And if they're actually violating the customer's rights, then customers are gonna hire some other agency to actually protect them from the so-called bad rights enforcement agency that's violating their rights. So basically, whoever's stealing from you or violating your rights is not really a rights enforcement agency. They're some criminal, and there's going to be actual rights enforcement agencies who are happy to take your money to provide you the service of protecting you from those criminals, and those are the agencies that will make money because they're the ones who have the customers, right?
Yeah,
hang on. Counterpoints. Let him finish his point. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, that's basically it. It's kind of like saying, well, what stops restaurants when you order a cheeseburger from giving you like something that's inedible and tastes terrible? Well, what stops you is if they do that, you're not going to go to that restaurant anymore. You'll go.
Well, that's not okay. That analogy is bad though, because what if the rich people that go there want their cheeseburger a certain way and they're paying more money to that restaurant. So the restaurant fucks over the average person because they want the more money from the wealthier person. You're basically advocating something that anyone that's a nerd like me that's played Shadowrun or Cyberpunk, that's the future you're advocating for. We have these multinational corporations, right, that can afford private security, that can enforce their whims. And you think that they'll be noble, but all the problems that you isolate would be magnified under the system of privatization, because we have evidence right now, a lot of the problems you talk about would be because corporations and things like that have profit motivations exclusively, and they don't care if they do things that we would consider immoral. So once they are controlling and money controls private security forces more, you say, well, if you don't like it, if Rob Noer makes $15 an hour, right? If he doesn't like it, we'll just go hire another security firm. Right, but all the most powerful security firms are going to go to where the most money is. And we could see that sort of dystopian idea, how you'll have basically private mercenary forces that aren't going to be benevolent. They're going to be at the behest of the bidding of the people that are paying them the most money. So the whole thing doesn't make sense to me. Like, for example, Fabian talks about how Connor and me will talk about how noble the police were. That's pretty presumptuous.
I never said that.
The same thing. What you said.
You said some people.
Yeah,
I said when talking to right-wingers, it's predominantly right-wing.
Okay, so I assumed that you were talking about Connor and me. But anyways, let me just say this. This argument is very similar to sort of the postmodernist communist arguments I have. One, if we get to nail down what societies have existed you're talking about, it'll be, but that's not true, anarcho-communism. And second, it'll be correctly identifying that there are tons of problems in our society. That's absolutely true. Only someone who's incredibly obtuse would ignore that problems exist. However, I think one of the things that kind of encapsulates the problem with this is something that Last Username said right at the beginning of his introduction, where he said, we might as well try this. No, that mentality is horrific, right? That mentality assumes that we live in such a hellhole that we might as well throw a Hail Mary. Right? That's not the case. All of the problems that you isolate here in both of your speeches, right? When you talked about things like, asset forfeiture and things like this, all of this would be magnified because the problems of police not being good people, okay, the same type of people are now going to be police, except instead of having the admittedly flawed system we have now where there's some accountability through people being able to vote and there being accountability that you have a predictable set of laws that are there. Now, instead of that, take an area the size of the United States, you would theoretically have, thousands of legal systems? Thousands. So you wouldn't know when you go from one town to another what their preference is, what corporation or massive wealth interest the current mercenaries that you're dealing with are dealing with, right? They're still going to attract people that you say are ignoble and things like that. That's not going to change. It's not that these people are going to be benevolent all of a sudden. Connor already makes the argument that we could already see in private security. Like, just go talk to I've dealt with, I can't tell you how many bouncers on power trips that I've dealt with. Now all of a sudden they have the power to arrest you. They have the power to jail you. They have the power to murder you. And as long as that system and the people paying the bills say it's okay, then that goes. So you're making the mistake of assuming things are as bad as they could get. You're isolating real problems that exist, but your solutions would make things infinitely worse. It's not doable. And what we would see is a bunch of, you say, well, different countries, right? Canada is not going to war with the United States. They solve things without sort of a legal system, but that's a completely different framework. These are predictable actors. And if you would break Canada up into basically hundreds of thousands of actors and break the United States up into hundreds of thousands of actors, you exponentially, especially when there's no pre-written, the law could change as seats fit to any of these actors at any specific time. They could, for example, the hypothetical.
Hey, Rob, would you like to make one point? Like you're literally just going on a rant.
I was about to jump in. Hang on a second, guys.
Sure.
Let's try, because both Scott and Rob, both you guys are talkers. We know that, right? It's cool. It's okay. but let's try to keep the floor open for a little bit more back and forth.
Okay.
I'm going to give it over to the ANCAP side before we get to you, Connor. Okay, but we're
Okay.
going to get to you, I promise. But let's just try to keep it within the scale of 1 or 2 points so that we can kick it back and forth, because otherwise people can't follow what's going on.
Yeah, so no more diatribes. Just try and keep it short and concise as possible.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let's
so
go
like, real quick,
address one of your problems.
Well, I'll let last username address the problem of the idea of the fact that they're only beholden to the rich, and then in the spirit of me not being a talker, I just want to take a couple of super quick things that you said that are really inflammatory and just blatantly wrong. So you said this is the dream of ethnonats. Ethnonats are usually socialists in their economics, and you sound like a leftist that says everything you don't like are Nazis. Anarchy means no laws. Well, I understand that you don't really understand what anarcho-capitalists are, and you haven't had a lot of interaction with us, but that's not what anarchism is about. Anarchism is not about rulers. It's about voluntary systems of self-governance or about contractual obligations of governance around. It's not no laws. We talked about how common law has been around for thousands of years, for 3,000 years. That's not true. British common law, of which America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK are based off of, starts in the 1470s with law of mercantilis, and the common law system that is developed in most of Europe is Napoleonic code law. And then the power to murder you, I just want to attack that real quick. No one has the power to murder you under this system, and that's just an attack. So I'll let all of that go.
So yeah, it's a common perception is that if you have a system like this, well, the rich will just use their money to buy these private cops and turn them into some sort of like personal army or something. So first of all, you've got to consider what exactly is the rich person doing with this very expensive army. I mean, I guess the insinuation is that they're somehow going to turn it against people and use it as to steal from people or something. But you can only steal as much as someone has, right? Like what, in order to, you can't steal like millions of dollars from a normal person who doesn't have millions of dollars. You can steal, whatever's in their pocket, whatever's in their wallet. And their people are going to pay to defend themselves from that theft, and they'll probably spend more than you're trying to steal in order to get it, right? So you want to get something from someone, you can either try to steal it or you can just buy it from them. And the question is it going to be cheaper to steal it or cheaper to just pay them what they want to sell it to you? And since people really don't want to be stolen from, they'll actually put they're willing to spend more than the cost of what you're stealing to stop you from stealing. But more fundamentally, think about what it means to be rich, right? What this means, practically speaking. Like, rich people don't have tons and tons of money in their pocket, right? They don't have like a mountain of gold in their backpack. What they have is a bunch of people in the society who are willing to enforce their claim on a bunch of assets, things like money in a bank account or some property that they own or some factories that they own or whatever. So then you have to ask, why do those people do that for them? Why is it that when Jeff Bezos calls the police and says, get this person off my lawn, the police will do it? But when the guy on the lawn says, get Jeff Bezos off my lawn, they won't do it. It's not because Jeff Bezos has some sort of magical power, magical richness power or something that makes everyone do what he says. It's because there's a system of laws, and the laws say that Jeff Bezos is the legitimate owner of that lawn. So when you talk about rich people using their riches to subvert the law, that doesn't quite make sense, because it's the law that actually makes them
True,
rich.
Yoshi.
You can't be rich unless there's a functional legal system to enforce your ownership over things. So I think you have to think about it a little more deeply than just, well, rich people will buy up the law and they'll control everything. It's not that simple, right?
Take
Okay.
Connor, if you want.
Yeah, please. Okay, so there's a couple of points that I want to make. So number one, maybe about 5-10 minutes ago, we were talking about like pushing externalities onto other people. I think this kind of goes exactly into what LEU was just talking about. If you have customers one of the things about the private market, you can praise it for so many things. You can praise it for efficiency. You can praise it for money making. You can praise it for this. You can praise it for that. But one of the things that you can't praise it for is not pushing externalities onto other parties. So what they like to do is they like to take their profits. They like to play within the legal system in order to make sure that they get what they need out of the situation. Then they like to push externalities onto their either onto their customers. And you're like, oh, well, the customers won't accept those externalities because there will be other competitive parties. Well, you know where those externalities go? They go to people who are not customers. They go to the public. They go to, so for instance, like pollution being an example, or looking through history, like we have examples of private entities doing this already. So I don't know why, when we suddenly make the state disappear, that like everybody becomes.
What are the externalities that you're expecting to see? Like generally speaking,
what am I expecting?
Avoids
okay,
externalities, right? It's
so
the public,
what I.
It's the government that creates externalities.
Also, for the record, negative externalities can't go to customers because of negative externalities.
Guys, you gotta let CounterPoints finish.
I was just clearing up definition.
Trying to elaborate his point.
So
what externalities do
you can't have a customer with a negative externality?
So for instance, so right now, the way that it works is public cops cannot randomly kick. They do kick the shit out of people, but they can't randomly walk up to a homeless person who's in a private shopping area and just start beating the dog shit out of him for entertainment. The reason why they can't is because we have a system of public expectation that's backed up by cameras and common law and all that kind of stuff, where if a agent of violence visits violence upon another person, they can expect the state to intercede on them if that violence was not justified. That's because we've extrapolated violence out to the state, of which a public law enforcement officer is merely an agent. Whereas in the private system, let's say that we had somebody like a company town, basically, and there was a homeless vagrant that moves into the company town. This person doesn't pay the private security firm. He's actually a drain on the resources. He's a drain on everything that society is all about. So what is to stop the private security firm from basically kicking the shit out of the person within an inch of his life and telling him to fucking kick rocks? What is the negative externality? And if you say that the homeless person can sue the private security firm within the town, that basically like, why and how is this preferable to the status quo?
Why is it preferable? I mean, what does a homeless person do now?
I'll let you answer last username for sure, but real quick, when you say they can't do that, let's use correct language, right? They can and they do. It's just not as common as you believe it would be under anarchism.
Yeah,
police definitely kick the shit out of homeless people. It happens.
Pretty hard for homeless people right now to sue the police when they get beat up.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, in a market system, if you have no money and someone violates your rights, you now have something valuable. You have a legal claim against them that you could get money for, since you can presumably prove that they wronged you and they owe you some money, and you can use that to acquire the resources you need to actually pursue it. If you need some representative, a legal representative or a rights enforcement agency to pursue this in arbitration, well, you can offer them, hey, I'll give you a cut of what we're going to win from this case. And if you have a good case, then they'll take it. It's worth it for them. They can make money.
What is the incentive? We have literally like throughout history, we've had criminal organizations kill over a few $100s. What is to prevent private organizations from participating in extrajudicial violence because they basically know that they can? What's to
other
prevent
private
extra
organizations?
Powerful?
Other private
okay.
organizations.
So the threat of retributive violence along lines that people can basically make up in order to secure property and power.
That's
so basically
literally the system you already live under.
Everything.
You hire people to
Fabian,
protect.
This is fucking bananas. You can keep saying that this is the system that we currently live under, but it's bullshit. Because if a law enforcement officer is videotaped kicking the shit out of somebody in our current system, that person wins millions of dollars.
Yes. That specific person wins millions of dollars, right? And the cop, presumably, if you're saying they just randomly for no reason kicks the shit out of somebody, right? Presumably they're punished, right? Because it's a clear-cut case that they were able to win millions of dollars. But where does that money come from, Connor?
Why does it matter?
Does it come from the? Does it come from?
Fabian,
where does it come
why
from?
Does it matter?
Answer the question.
Your system No. You can tell me why
Okay,
it matters.
so we'll
When
pivot.
it's in
Hang
your
on,
system.
Connor, because before I don't want you to reframe it. If he's asking you a direct question, answer the direct question, and then you can respond with something. But
Okay,
I would
sure.
like
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
like
go
that
ahead and ask
answered.
me the question.
Where does the money come from when a police officer in, let's say, in a community violates the rights of a person and is found guilty in civil court?
The state.
The state is an extrapolation of the taxpayer. The
Right.
taxpayer is the communal good is basically
Right.
the associated
Right. The
unitarian
state
good.
also
How-
has the power to tax, right?
So
So
that's
the
an
incentive
externality.
structure is that incentive structure is part of the crux of the argument as to why we say the free market is a better system for creating more efficient policing systems that are less likely to violate your rights,
Okay,
because
if-
they don't have the power to
Efficiency
tax.
as a metric, I don't think should even be
If-
considered.
if
with
I
law
may.
enforcement.
Okay, so
If
we'll
I
get
may
rid of
jump
You
in.
all
don't like
efficiency.
externalities, Connor, and that's
If
an
I may
externality,
jump in.
right?
It's an economic question of efficiency.
When the police
so-
fuck up, we pay their fines, we pay their penalties. That's an extra.
Okay, and what do you
No,
think
in
would
fact,
happen
Connor,
if you were
please,
paying
let me-
private insurance
let me-
for fucking?
Hang on, Rob,
a
hang on,
private
let him
No,
finish
you're
his
not.
chance.
You're suing the people who beat you up. They're the ones paying, and if it's a rights enforcement agency, they're paying.
And
Do
they
you
have
think that they're not going to externalize risk to insurance companies?
How?
All you're
They
doing is you're
can.
creating. How can they not? How do you
They-
think that they
how could-
wouldn't
I don't
sign up for
understand.
private insurance? What are you talking about? This is your ideology.
If you sue
You're
someone,
suing
they have to
individuals. You
pay.
think private
If-
security?
if
you
it's
think
our
private security firms aren't
ideology,
gonna have insurance?
if it's our ideology and you're saying how, and you assume that you understand our ideology better than we do despite devoting our lives to it, you might want to stop and think, and maybe think that we're asking you
No,
how
because
because
our-
you have a
no.
misunderstanding.
No,
Okay,
because I've
insurance
already
doesn't
considered. No.
externalize.
Dude, can I have the fucking mic for a goddamn second?
Yeah.
This is my fucking problem. Is because even under your system, exactly what I'm describing would be possible. And if you wanted to prohibit exactly what I'm talking about, you would need the state in order to do so. To pretend that within a purely privatized society, there wouldn't be insurance companies that were willing to underwrite private security firms, and that they would take on the lawsuits from private citizens who said that their rights were violated by a rights enforcement agency, for you to dismiss that as not a possibility within your system? What
If
the
an
fuck
insurance
are you
company
talking
wanted to
about?
do
No,
that, they
no,
could,
real
but
quick. I'll
if they do
answer that real quick.
carelessly, they're gonna
There's
lose money.
nothing wrong
To
with
make
that.
money, you'll have to actually charge people premiums that are more than their
Right.
liability.
Like that-
Hang on,
that's
guys.
how-
We haven't had an opportunity to let Rob get in much. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Rob.
Sure.
Right. So, like, even in what Connor's saying here, right? Like, do you work with insurance? You know that the cost will eventually be paid to the people that are hiring these firms in the first place. They're going to have insurance, right? And furthermore, like, let's go with last username's example here. Like, the poor person gets the shit kicked out of them, but some private firm takes the case because they think that that's worth monetary value. Well, why wouldn't this just be settled between these firms that have money? Like, you'd be able to settle with the firm representing the homeless person, who would then be under no obligation to give any money to the homeless person in the first place. So,
Well,
if
so
you would need
actually, I
to
can
have-
answer
well,
that.
and real quick,
I can
please,
answer that.
please,
Well,
please,
you're gonna
please.
make like 10 more points, and you ask the question.
Okay, you're
so
right.
I'll quickly
I've been dominating
answer.
the time here. Oh wait, that's been
No,
you
I'll
guys.
quickly
But go ahead,
answer the
Fabian.
question that you asked.
No.
Let you
Rob,
continue.
you get to go. No way. Yeah, you've been quiet for
Wait,
a long
well,
time.
no, you just
Go on,
asked the
Rob.
question, so I wanted to answer the question
I made
instead
a
of
point.
burying
You
it.
It may be a compound question. Let's let him finish. Go ahead, Rob.
And the other thing that's problematic with this is it assumes, you say if his rights were violated, but it assumes that there is a unilateral rights that people would all agree to. And this is the point I wanted to get to with Fabian. He says that I'm being a leftist, claiming that anyone that disagrees with me is a Nazi. No, it just makes sense. It follows from what your description of your system would be. For example, if a bunch of people in particular, let's say the town I live in, if everyone gets together and say, we don't want people that look like Pedro here, you're out. And we all come together and we're all paying the security
Pedro,
firm to say,
get the
keep
fuck
people
out.
that look right, keep people that look like Pedro out, with glasses. That's
Thought
what I'm
the
talking
crib would have been
Right,
cool,
but,
all right,
if they
I'll move
say-
out.
if they say that, like, and then Pedro comes and the security firm says, no, dude, you're out. We don't want your kind here. And they beat the shit out of Pedro. That was within the legal rights of the people that beat the shit out of him, because they're going to say that's the law
No,
in
it's
our
not.
system. Yep, real quick. And they're going to
How
say
not?
they're going to say because
Oh my God.
there is no, you can't point to without a system of state and state having enforcement powers. You can't point to how everyone will universally agree to the same
We can.
things. You won't.
Well,
Okay,
I don't
so
know why
you
you're
have
just saying
two
that.
questions.
You
not
haven't
a-
even asked us how it would work. Why are you just saying, well, you can't? I mean, if you can't
Because you
imagine
can't.
it, I understand that.
You've literally
But let me
watched 30
explain.
minutes of. You've watched 20 minutes of me, and
Hey,
maybe you know a
CounterPoints,
little
do I
bit
have the
about what's
option to
using.
get a stronger security fears because I do not want to get my ass whooped. Honestly,
Don't
Yeah, bro, I
don't
got you.
worry. Don't worry. What he's talking about isn't anarcho-capitalism. It's his straw man.
So you complain that everyone wouldn't agree on the laws. Well, that's true, but that doesn't matter. It's not that everyone has to agree on laws, just like everyone doesn't agree on prices, right? Things aren't a certain price because everyone agreed that should be the price. They're a certain price because that's where the forces balance out, the market forces, and that price emerged from that. So what rights people have will emerge in a certain way, just like prices and the features of products emerge in that through market forces. Certain rights will be wanted a lot by people and very cheap to enforce. Other rights will be not wanted as badly and very expensive to enforce. And you know, the high quality, the cheap wanted rights will be what people tend to get, and the expensive, not so important rights will tend to go away, right?
And I mean, it's as I said in my opening.
Why
this
are
is
rights
just-
being negotiated?
This is
What the
all
fuck?
this is it's just
Why
word
not?
salad, right? And constantly you say, "Oh, you just can't imagine it." Like it's literally
word
the same thing
salad.
as arguing with communists. You just can't imagine it in the way we're talking about. No, this is exactly if you take away the state's monopoly and force
We never
having
said
sort
that.
of state. That is what you said. That's what you've said the entire time.
No, it's
you just
not.
don't
We've
imagine
never
it. You've
said
only
that
been
once.
Whenever we
minutes.
make a point, you
there's
just say that
no
we're not
reason-
sufficiently understanding you.
Right, and just let me real quick. I'll just be 15
Because you're
more
making
seconds.
claims
Like,
that aren't what we
the
claim.
problem is you're isolating problems and saying things are so bad right now. There are problems. No one disagrees with that. And then you say, so we're going to have this radical departure. And yet it only takes a short amount of time to realize, no, this radical departure is going to exacerbate all of the problems you're talking about. And then your answer to that's, no, you just can't imagine it. I mean, it's nonsense.
That's
It's
not my
You're telling me
answer.
you can't imagine it. And that's fine. I'm just
No, I'm
let me
asking you to
explain.
ask the questions, and then we're telling you answers to those things.
But the answers you've given aren't functional, right? Like the answer you've given, well, the homeless person would be able to sue because there'd be some law firm somewhere that would take on the homeless person's case. One, that would be more likely to happen in the system we have now,
probably.
rather than a system where you literally have tens of thousands of codes of laws across the country, and those laws are being enforced strictly through privatization and people that have the money being able to enforce. We can see right now in our current system that there's all sorts of laws that people that like currency manipulation. There's, we saw the financial collapse of 2008. You'll say, well, that's all indicative of the current system. Yes, but that thing would be infinitely worse if we give power to say those that have more money get more enforcement mechanism through the law. Yes,
They
there
don't.
are problems
They
with our
don't.
current system, but it would be
Well,
infinitely worse under your system.
just to try to move this along just a little bit, Rob, when you say what your answer will be is blank, I don't want a bunch of building of straw mans that we have to untangle. So let's try to be as concise as we can with the language. We've got 2 on 2. I want to try to get to the heart of these things as fast as we can. Go ahead, guy.
Yeah, like I'd love to explain this to you guys, but it seems like you guys are trying your hardest to prevent us from explaining anything. You're just saying your answer is going to be this. You have no answer to this. You can't explain blah blah blah. Well, yeah, we can. Just let us. All right. I mean, if you want to know how this works, okay. So a firm is considering whether to give people the right to not be murdered. Let's say, and they'll look at how much will people pay for the right to not be murdered. And also look at what will be the cost of enforcing this right. What will be the expenses to us of making sure that our customers don't get murdered? And if the revenue that they'll get from customers paying for that right is more than the cost of enforcing it, then they'll probably offer it as part of their package of rights. Right?
Yeah, I
Pretty
agree.
simple. And through a
That's
whole
it.
bunch of
That is
decisions
it.
like that,
But
you'll
the
get a
problem
set
is-
of
the
rights.
problem
Why
is
is the right to not
The
get
problem
murdered
is
be
you're
it
talking about
for
something as
sale?
simplistic like as murder, right? So let's say that instead,
Yeah.
in California,
And the other things will be
where
more
Silicon
complicated,
Valley
but
has so
it's the
much
same
money.
basic idea.
No, okay. So if you're so let me. So
give
let's
us
say
your
in
perfect
Silicon
straw
Valley,
man. Give us your
please.
No, just give us. You're saying give us the perfect example of why you think this would be
baby, you
difficult.
gotta let him interact. You don't know if he's strawmanning or not. You cut him off.
No, I'm not accusing him of strong. I'm asking him to. I'm saying give us the perfect example of a
Okay, I
situation
got
you
you.
think won't work.
Yeah. So I got you. I'll give you the perfect straw man. Why the fuck are we negotiating people's rights not to be murdered when we can extrapolate out as a public externality through taxes a relative guarantee to not be murdered? That way we remove the profit incentive over whether or not people are going to get fucking murdered.
Yeah,
Why
that's not-
would
that's
we
not-
ever
on the market
trust?
to better-
Why would we?
I mean, we're
ever,
negotiating our
ever,
rights now
ever
Right,
the
fucking
political
yeah,
process.
externalize this to a private
Counter.
It's not like a right
I
given
appreciate-
to us
I
from the
appreciate-
sky. Like we have politics
so-
and conflict and people arguing over
So
what
this
our rights
is-
are and negotiating them.
This
So
is where Last Username and I.
why is that so?
This is
what-
where Last Username and I disagree on how fundamentally we, I think, look at rights, because I don't necessarily believe that rights are negotiable in that response. I would actually say that you, as the statist living in America, are negotiating your rights by saying that the Constitution and the government affords your rights, and that political processes are what determine what your rights are and what your rights aren't. And the Supreme Court and all of the ways the Constitution has been changed in constitutional amendments and so forth have determined what those rights are and aren't. I subscribe to a theory or a philosophy that rights are objective, that there is a natural law, and that I believe that the state violates those things, and I believe that it is an immoral system for that. I find things like taxation to be against natural law, because it says that the state owns a portion of my body and a portion of my labor, right? And so that is the main reason why
Can I
I
ask you about
advocate
that?
for a
'Cause that's like
voluntaristic
a-
system.
It's a fundamental axiomatic, like it's a fundamental position.
Right, which is what you
And
asked
so
for.
you no, and I appreciate that, but you use the term natural
Mhm.
when describing it,
Mhm.
and I promise you, I'm not trying to straw man, but it seems like this perspective is rigidly individualistic. But what I would say is that if you look at history, it's not a history of individuals, and it's not purely a history of collectives. It's a history of the interplay between individuals and collectives. And if you look at like people, as a whole, whether you're talking about like great rulers or individual citizens, it's always been a negotiation between the private and the public. So what in natural history tells you that you are an island that doesn't have to negotiate with your surroundings or the power structures that are around you? What about history or naturalism tells you that you are an autonomous individual free from the powers and concerns of others?
Yeah, so two things. A bunch of things. One, it is individualistic, and the reason is because collectives don't have actions, individuals have actions, and they make up collectives. The individual is the smallest denominator here, the individual conscious. So that would be the answer to that. It's just one to say that the collective is the important thing here is just anti-rational. From my position,
I'm not saying
disagree.
that. I'm saying it's the interplay between the two.
Right. And when you say naturalistic, I think you're misunderstanding what natural law is. Natural law just means an objective ethic. It's an objective law. So it logically can't flow. So for example, saying that God gives us certain rights or certain laws that we must follow would also be a natural law, right? It is an objective. I come from a position that we can discover objective law through rationality and through logic.
So what about history or your rationality?
It's not
or
a
your
historical
rational
analysis.
analysis of history. What's that?
It's not a historical analysis.
Why
Right.
wouldn't it be if you could look to history for the way that humans have existed in the past, and you're using your rational mind to figure out how human beings interact with society? And
Because
you've
that's not
decided
what
that's
rational
something that
means.
human beings. Okay, well,
That's not how logic
this is an
works.
important. Okay, well, this is an important. Well, wait. Please explain to me how logic works.
Right. Logic is a system of equations, and in like, I can't
Man,
fucking
switch it way
define.
off.
my equation.
Hang on, we're getting way off into the fucking weeds.
This
Right,
is
right,
right.
not.
Bring-
This is
we-
fundamental.
Right.
Well,
No,
it
you're-
could- hang on. It could be. Hang on. It could be that it's fundamental, right?
Mhm.
But then, if it is fundamental, tie it into how it is fundamental.
Okay, let me try to see. Let me try. What we're saying is what I said at the beginning, that you could talk about these things in theory and on paper.
Damn, right as I
Connor's
slip up
making
for
the
a
point,
second,
like,
he
we
interrupts
see
me. I
the
got
history
fucked
of
on that
human
one.
interactions and how humans actually act in the real world. And basically to say, well, logic doesn't
Yeah.
work like that. It's external of that. No, because there's a fundamental flaw in the logic then if we could never point to this being existence in human history. Or if we could
Nobody's
point to
saying
why
that.
the existence of human interactions through history show that these sorts of things wouldn't be possible.
No, when you're asking me for the rationale right, that is occurring in the vacuum of understanding ethics, and you want a historical analysis, or that didn't happen in this portion of history, therefore it's not right, that actually is a logical fallacy, right? That's an appeal to history. Right.
Let me make it specific. Like, you asked for a specific example for me. So let me say this. You hear all the time about like these towns like in New York when Amazon was coming in, right? And they were going to have so many jobs there. So let's take a town like that.
Poor
Now, we can
AOC.
see- Right. Yeah. So we can see the tech companies and, you know, their beliefs. So let's say that Amazon has a town in some small town in New York, right? And the entire economy is built on the corporation of Amazon. And so they, in your system, they control the local police or mercenaries or insurance company or whatever you want to call them. They control it. And they say, yeah, murder's bad and free speech is good and all that stuff. But we don't consider it free speech to be able to criticize Amazon. We don't consider, real quick, we don't consider it free speech for you to be able to talk negatively about the positions of leadership or the police or the insurance companies that are here. And we also don't want anyone using any other services that compete with us in our, why? And we're allowed to enforce that through violence if necessary. And if you fight back and it escalates, well, we don't consider that murder because we're just defending our legal system.
Dude, how many questions are you going to ask? Like how deep are you going to go down the rabbit hole of an analogy?
If I can address that real quick, I don't know if you have a mind that's capable of understanding. That's not multiple questions. That's explaining a scenario and asking.
Right, but I already disagree with the fundamental.
Like you not being able to handle it mentally and say
Rob Noer,
how many questions you're going to ask.
Don't patronize
that's not a good look for you.
But Rob Noer, don't patronize me. The problem is
don't patronize me.
At the beginning of it, right? You're asking me to walk with you in a scenario that we don't believe is a rational scenario to begin with, and then you go deeper and deeper and deeper into creating this dystopian future, and then go, well, what about this scenario, this dystopian model that I've presented? Please explain how it works under this dystopia.
Scott,
well, so
no, I find it hilarious.
We're getting right to it. The Counterpoints is right. He asked the perfect question: why?
Okay, so first of all, monopolistic tendencies are already worse under the state than they are under anarchism. Number one, so the likelihood that you have the company town is less likely to exist under anarcho-capitalism than it is in the United States of America.
Okay, but Scott, I already have a problem with your logic there, because if we look at the most free, economically free times in American history, if we look at the late 19th and early 20th century, basically what we see monopolies forming and them using vertical and horizontal monopolization in order to beat out competition. So
the problem with saying that was the most economically free time is that was also a time where the Pinkertons and moonlighting police officers and the National Guard
via the state, police and private security.
Well, the National Guard wasn't private police. The National Guard being brought in to beat the living shit out of people protesting for working conditions because they weren't allowed to go against a system of monopolies that were directly supported and funded by the state. It was some of the least free market times in our history because the state was giving out mining rights, they were giving out railroad rights, they were supporting them. When the labor unions tried to strike or tried to have wildcat strikes, they would intentionally put mail onto carts so that we could stop them.
Point, buddy. We have to go back to this point.
Yeah, you said it was the most economically free time, and that proves me wrong. And I'm just showing you all the ways the state used violence to enforce those monopolies.
Okay, but give me a second, because the way that you disagree with our criticisms of your worldview, I disagree with your description of reality. Okay, so on one hand, I see what you're saying, where the arm of the state was used in a corrupt way in order to enforce private interest, and I understand that. But basically, my criticism of your perspective would be that, like, by removing the state, all you're doing is you're removing an institution that has to maintain some level of appearance of non-corruption and public interest. Whereas, as soon as you make it purely private, where is the incentive to be non-corrupt, and where is the incentive not to represent private interest, particularly when you're being hired directly by that private interest? And I won't talk for too much longer because I want you to address that, because my recollection of history is that the Pinkertons were private police hired to get dirt on industrial rivals and beat the shit out of people who were organizing for fucking, workers' rights and shit. So what part of my assessment of that part of reality is incorrect?
No, you're 100% right that the Pinkertons were a private security firm that were hired to do that, right? You're also 100% right if you were to go one step further and say that the moonlighting police officers were hired by corporations and companies. I'm simply saying that they were able to do these injustices because they were given power and authority from the state. The state looked the other way when these things happened, and anytime a labor movement tried to fight for any amounts of rights or go against these monopolies that were created by the state used its own violence to quash those things. And I just wouldn't call that the most free market capitalist time improving free market.
No.
Hold
on, because we're almost at consensus.
Probably the Republic of Cospaya from 1440 to 1826.
Okay, but I want to ask this because I feel like I could almost understand a certain perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So without the state giving the Pinkertons and the National Guard and the moonlighting police officers the authority of the badge, then in your system, I'm asking this because I'm almost here. Mm-hmm. Basically, in your system, the workers, because they would be able to outsource their security as well, their security firms or their private firms would have as much authority to enforce security and nonviolence as the Pinkertons, and as a result, it wouldn't be a one-sided fight. Do I understand that correctly, or am I making shit up in my head?
No, you're not making shit up. I would say that is right, though it's obviously not the whole picture, and I'll let Last Username fill in. I'm sure he has some ideas. I don't want to monopolize the stage.
Well, okay, so I don't know. Talking about the Pinkertons, and I'm not sure if that's really analogous to what we're talking about. I want to go back to what Rob asked about Walmart. You said Walmart wants to stop everyone from saying bad things about Walmart. Okay, if they want that right, the right to stop other people from bad mouthing Walmart, they're going to have to pay for that. That means they're going to have to pay the cost of, first of all, enforcing that law, which is probably going to be pretty expensive. But also, they're bidding against everybody else who wants the right, presumably, to criticize Walmart and are willing to pay for that right. So this is going to be a pretty expensive right for Walmart to get, because not only have to pay to actually stop people from speaking, but they have to outbid what other people are willing to pay to have the right to speak.
But it doesn't.
Whatever Walmart wants in that case, there's probably a cheaper way to get it than using force to stop people from bad-mouthing Walmart, especially since everyone's going to know that.
No, the point, it's just one example. We could keep going with that example.
Sure.
By the way, I
Let's
said
take
Amazon.
another example.
But no, I get you. It's no big deal. But
Okay.
but nonetheless, you can see in that particular area, they're already going to win the outbidding war because they control the local economy in that area.
So.
And why wouldn't they? So if I'm reliant on Walmart and your example for my job, and I say, you know what, I'm going to take my business. What am I going to do? And this is another problem that just doesn't make sense. So you can have all of these regions, and the people with the most money in those regions set the law as they see fit and set the enforcement as they see fit. What do you do if you don't like it? You'd say, well, people will vote with their feet. So we're just going to have people picking up roots and moving anytime they want. Town A says we allow.
By the way, we have historical examples of those.
So again, when you're not actually reacting to the statement that Last Username made, right? What he's talking, well, maybe, but you're doing it tangentially, and I don't think maybe we can dig into it a little deeper, right? When he's saying it's more expensive, what he's saying is that the company has now incurred a cost, right? Under our current system of the state, we have regulatory capture. We have systems like tariffs that allow people that are have their portfolios or their money or their businesses more diversified. We have tax systems that benefit the rich. We have judicial systems that specifically disproportionately help those that have the ability to pay for better systems, whereas arbitration tends to lean more heavily towards those who are poorer because of the way in which they're more the financial incentive is usually to actually go towards those with less capital. So we have a lot of systems in place in the state that support this this thing that you have, right? But when you take away and you strip away those things, what you're left with is market competition. And so when a business chooses to do something that a lot of people don't like and don't want, and they start to incur a cost because of that, because they're trying to enforce this lack of free speech in that area, what it does is it creates a market void, because whatever product it is that they are selling or whatever it is that they're providing, other companies that won't infringe on your free speech, other company town, for example, or another town very close by, or even an area within that community, right? They have the ability to compete against that company, and that company is incurring additional costs by trying to do something that nobody wants.
That's not true,
Scott,
right? And you can see monopolization would mean like,
What's not true?
We're talking. Well, listen, the cost wouldn't outweigh the benefit that they could get in many scenarios, and like we could do this easily. Like we're talking about things like products like Amazon, Walmart, and things like that. How about who controls the land that food's produced on? How about who controls the water pipes and things like that? Let's say that, you know, or even if you're talking about something like Silicon Valley and the tech company, you get like a monopoly of a company that basically everyone just through ease of access or through whatever reason is basically using one product 90% of the time, like Alphabet that owns.
Yeah, but
Google.
that's the state.
So Alphabet,
Again, that's the state.
Please let me finish. So if Alphabet decides that they're going to use corrupt corporate practices to go after all of their competitors and crush them, and
What's
they're providing a
corrupt
service
corporate
that basically
practices? What do you
people
mean by that?
need, right?
Let
Sorry,
him
go
finish.
ahead.
You gotta let him finish. No, finish,
Yeah,
Rob.
I
Go-
want him
go
to
ahead.
finish, but I want it to be clear too. I want to understand what you're saying.
Okay, good. What's the question?
Corrupt corporate practices. Be specific.
Right, so there's corporate espionage, corporate attacks, stealing of IP. These things occur all the time, right? And it would be even more incentive. Right now, there's at least some framework to say that these things are outlawed, and there's some way. And again, you're just saying, well, things exist now that are bad, but magically, any scenario you give in the future, we'll just ignore and say, no, that's dystopian. It wouldn't happen.
We're
The
not
reality
saying
is these
magic.
things
So
would
if
happen
the
even
espionage
more.
is illegal,
Please. The reality is these things would happen even more and would encourage even more monopolies. And when those monopolies get to the point where people basically rely on them for their service, whether it be something like building cars or tech, where we see one company controlling 90% of the market share, or more fundamental things like food and water, then the cost that incurs to keeping that
but
monopoly.
again, Rob,
through
you're breaking our argument and then strawmanning it. Like if you want to know what would happen in the case of espionage, you can ask that, but you didn't. You just said, well, espionage would happen and there'd be no law against it and blah blah blah.
I'll ask you. I'll leave you answer real quick, but I'll just say this for 30 seconds. This is childishness. This is absolute childishness, because every time we point out real scenarios that would logically progress from your system, you say, no, we're able to explain it in a way that it wouldn't happen. You haven't asked us. Where are we supposed to sit here? So this is the debate. We sit here and go, you're right, this is a perfect system. We'll just ask you questions. Corporate espionage, and then you'll explain for 20 minutes how it's impossible to happen under your system. Wouldn't happen. And if it did happen, noble, benevolent
It's
insurance companies
impossible.
would
I'm just
step in
saying that
using their mercenaries.
there's no
to make sure
reason
it
there
didn't
would be
happen. It's just
any
silliness.
more
You
likely
haven't
to
asked
happen
me.
under the
You
current
haven't asked
system.
me.
Probably
I have a
less.
special version of the state. that
Someone
would be
commits
able to
corporate
solve all the
espionage,
problems
use
you're
a rights
asking.
enforcement agency to go and
real quick, just-
pursue
Okay,
legal
hold on,
action
Rob.
against
All
them.
right, hang on, guys. Let's try this. So I do agree in a sense that Rob is making a good point, that it is important that he be able to flesh your position out with hypotheticals that do make sense. If he does that, and then you say, well, our system accommodates for that, I also think that that's valid, right? So this is how we can have the course of discussion without it getting too far off of the rails. Last username hasn't really had a chance to respond to this in an in-depth way. He's just been kind of fleshing out Rob's position. Last username, you have the floor.
Right.
God, I love him as a moderator.
Espionage would probably be a crime, depending on what kind of espionage you're talking about. But corporations would have rights too. They would hire rights enforcement agencies to protect their rights and to pursue legal action against other corporations that violated their rights. In the case of espionage,
Mark,
assuming
can
you're
you do
talking
that for
about
me?
something illegal. I don't
chat.
see why
In chat,
that would be more of a problem in
Read
a
chat.
stateless society.
and then
You haven't
help
really
him get the
explained
links.
Can I,
Why do you think? it
Rob?
would be?
Yeah, go ahead.
Rob. But before, So to put a point on this, geography is obviously would be a major challenge for this in a globalized, technologically sophisticated world, because as you basically parochialize, as you regionalize these different law sets, who's to say that if you're living in a corporate town that believes that
Tarek,
intellectual
relax.
property
He's
is
just-
a thing that like
he's
you should
trying to
have
use
a
language
international
colloquially
rights
for the
enforcement
right-wingers.
agency that's or not even national, right? Because we're trying to move past that. But a globalized rights enforcement agency that can enforce property law But then if there's like a regional rights enforcement agent, because we're talking about security firms, that's what we're talking about. And security firms are made up of dudes who like to fight. Let's be fucking real about what they really are. So if let's say that your intellectual property was being stolen from a regional area in Brazil, how is your rights enforcement agency literally going to get on a plane, go to Brazil, and then enforce your intellectual property? They're going to end up diced up and thrown in barrels. This is why we rely on the state and monopoly of force in order to do these things, because basically they can go kick the shit out of everybody. That's kind of the point, is that there's a standard of expectation.
Intellectual property is a special.
Well, Tom, they would send
I'm saying IP is like a totally different thing, right? Like we could get into that, but then we would be derailing on a I'm pretty sure last year's
Rob asked about corporate espionage, which would probably be stealing ideas and industrial trade secrets in order to create
Well, he didn't specify what it was.
Pure technology. Well, I mean, that's what it's used for now. Doesn't that logic?
All I'm saying is, I think last username and I actually disagree a little bit on IP. I'm 100% against IP existing at all. So I mean, that's just my belief system.
Even if so, but you do not like theft. So if somebody had created a proprietary technique to produce a certain good, and somebody sneaks into their computer system and steals their schematics that they labored and toiled on, you don't care about that because it's intellectual, so who cares?
No, there's tons of other laws you just broke, right? Like you broke into you hacked into their systems, you probably did something to get on their property, maybe you did it only on the internet.
Then my question still stands logically, where it's like, okay, this person does this from a geographically disparate locale. You would have to pay a rights enforcement agency to travel to that location in order to try to enforce your rights. And then at that point, they're at the mercy or the whim of the rights enforcement agency or security organization of that region.
Well, see,
how does
this
not present a problem?
I'll tell you how it doesn't present a problem, right? I'll tell you why right now, because there are like thousands of grandmas in America right now that are stupidly opening emails from Nigerian princes. And if you just give them a little bit of information, a little bit of banking information, right? They promise that they'll wire transfer over triple the amount of money that occurred. This shit happens, right? And the American government doesn't enforce it because it's not it's not something they can enforce, right? So, I mean, obviously, if you're talking about something that's grievous enough, something that's gargantuan, like maybe like state actor level or something, you know, then maybe like we can talk about why it might be impertinent to send rights enforcement agencies over there or something like that. But what will likely occur is we will target those people, understand that those people or whatever that institution is something that steals from people. They will gain a reputation for things like that. If they want to do business with us at some point, they're probably going to have to pay extra money. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like,
wait, who's we and us?
What do you mean, who's we and us?
Like,
the hypothetical anarchist community that is existing in the example that he gave.
We're talking, it'll be more localized than that, right? So like if I live in Brazil and actors on my behalf, and there's no longer Brazil, but I live in the geographic location that once was Brazil. And this is another flaw with your system. States still will exist. You can't unilaterally declare anarcho-fascism everywhere, and these states will take advantage because
anarcho-fascism and states will exist elsewhere. Why is that a problem?
Because, like, for example, what happens if a state actor decides they want to invade what was formerly the United States?
We have historical examples of this, right? We have historical examples of the Republic of Cospaia that lasted from 1440 to 1826, and they were sandwiched in between the Florence and the Papal States, and they lasted for longer than America has currently lasted as an anarchist community, and they didn't invade them, and there's reasons why they didn't invade them.
But again, the system failed eventually, right? They're not an
so did
system.
Rome, like so has Ukraine. Like, what are you talking about?
Like, and all of these, like, you know, people want to bring up what's the Sharon and stuff like that, right? All of these like low tech societies that existed kind of on the fringes for some amount of time and act like that means like
Sharon still exists
now. That like you can't just, for example, if China decided they wanted to invade what was formerly the United States, There would be nothing that the former United States could do to call up a bunch of insurance agents and say, hey, get your local mercs on the ground. In fact, if China was such a power and they would do some sort of calculus and said, actually, we'd probably be better off to join sides with China because it would have a financial incentive for us to do so. There'd be no military. We wouldn't be able to upkeep like things in the military, such as weapons, modern weapons that would be able to deal with China. So people would be left to the small arms that they had, and countries that would see themselves in a resource shortage or something like that would no doubt take advantage and come into the resource-rich United States, United States.
Yeah, I can answer that. I can answer that pretty easily. Like, I actually have a whole YouTube video, and it's pretty good. You should check it out. So economic entanglement is a big portion of what's important for an anarchist community to survive, right? So Tehran is a great example that you brought that up. Like, why hasn't Mexico invaded Tehran, right? Well, the reason they haven't invaded Tehran is because what they were doing is chopping down had illegal mining, logging companies coming in and poisoning their water and things like that. And it was easy to oppress them. And then when they fought back, what ended up occurring is they economically entangled themselves with the Mexican state. So when they improved from logging into tree sap, they were able to sell tree sap and chemicals to the Mexican government. And they also started to create concrete blocks for construction. And so once they became trade partners, all of a sudden, war is expensive, right? I mean, like, look at the Afghanistan war, right? It's not because these people are there's this big supreme power that it was such a shit show for so long. It's because it's expensive and it's costly, and it's costly on the nation state and things like that. Economic entanglement, being a trading partner and having a stable anarchist society, is often in and of itself enough to defend from. So Tehran, with a population of 18,000 that has now planted 3,000 hectares of forest, has tripled the income of the people that have been living there since they became anarchists, and hasn't had a major crime with a population of 18,000 or 11,000, depending on the estimates you use, hasn't had a major crime since 2015. I think it's a great example of how a small anarchist community can exist with nation states.
Let's talk about Tehran for a minute. First, does Tehran get state funding?
As far as I'm aware, they do not have state funding or taxes.
The report I read said that they still get state funding. The report I read also showed that there's not really property ownership. If you want to do something,
it's anarcho-mutualist, yeah. It's anarcho-mutualist, right. Indigenismo, and anarcho-environmentalist.
Right. So it's the opposite of the problem that you're trying to solve to maximize individual liberty and property. You no longer have property. So it's actually sort of anarcho-socialism, which is antithetical to everything you're. So using that as
it's anarcho-mutualist, but yeah.
Right. So other things to talk about with Tehran. The population density of Tehran is 222 per square mile. Right. That means basically it's a farming community. It's super low tech. It's racially homogenous, and they discourage outsiders from either showing up.
Well, they don't discourage outsiders from showing up. They just make sure that you take your political affiliations and any bumper stickers and things like that away from them. I mean, it depends on what you mean by discourage.
Well, like they encourage marrying within the community and keeping the community as homogenous as possible.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, now real quick. So back when I said previously that there would be enclaves of ethno-nationalists and things like that, and you said we'll dismiss this. This is nonsense. That's similar to what I'm not saying they're ethno-nationalists, but you could see there are a bunch of people that have declared laws and things like that are seemingly not universal laws that we'd all accept, such as you can't have a political party. So if you're in that region, you can't have a political party. There are all sorts of other things like that we consider that we need universal laws that you could, as an enclave of people, say, no, we have a different interpretation of what we want. And your argument is, well, there would be a price associated with that. So I'll ask you point blank, do you think most of the people in the world would favor a system that says that you can't come together politically under a banner or under a name?
Do I think that most people currently would support a system where they can't have political parties?
Correct.
I mean, I guess it would depend upon whether or not they live under an anarchist society. Like, that's an impossibility to answer.
They don't. We know they don't. So I'm asking right now, do you think most people would favor a town that says you cannot be a member of a political party? You're not free to associate politically with people in that manner.
Well, I mean, you're asking me to answer a question that would require them to live under different circumstances.
No, I'm not. I'm asking you right now the status quo. It doesn't require living under a different circumstance.
What do people tend to prefer the status quo? Yes.
No, okay.
In general.
Anyways, it's an interesting deflection from the question. But under your deflection,
No,
because
your
most
question-
people don't favor.
your question
okay,
doesn't
so
make
because right
sense.
now, right, it makes sense because most people don't right now. And you in last username said, well, if most people were upset about the unique, trivial laws of a place, it would harm that place financially significant until where they would have to. The cost would be so great that they would change back to get more in line with what the average opinion is. Why hasn't Sharon done that?
Because they're not anarcho-capitalists. They're anarcho-mutualists, indigenismo, and anarcho-environmentalist. It's a
Okay,
different
so one-
form of anarchism.
Right. So one, I wouldn't use that as an example for your position. And secondly, what you can see is that cost.
Well,
even
I
if they're
used-
communal,
you
even
brought
if
up
they're
Tehran.
communal, There's
You brought
no
up Tehran. I
reason-
didn't. I brought up
there's
Republic
you
of
brought up
Kospaya.
Tehran.
No, you brought it up.
Okay, you're right. I did mention it first, but I've heard you bring it up in the past. Nonetheless, even that they're communal, there's still no reason that your argument that there would be these external costs based on people outside of that area that would be implied to them that would make them. There's no reason. It's totally arbitrary to say, well, they're anarcho-communal instead of anarcho-capitalist. That's why the external costs don't matter.
What causes what issues are you talking about?
For example, I said
that
if you
there
had
is
a
no
particular-
differentiation between the two.
Right. So, for example, when I talked about the Amazon town, like you in last username said, well, they wouldn't limit speech that was critical of Amazon because if they did, many people outside of that system would say, we find that to be sort of arbitrary and we don't like that. And so there would be financial cost to them for doing so. There's no reason that if they were anarcho-communal as opposed to anarcho-capitalist, that external cost wouldn't still apply. You can't give me a reason that would show that distinction.
Why in the fuck would an anarcho-mutualist society that doesn't have private property have Jeff Bezos towns? The fuck are you talking about?
That's not what I'm saying.
He's talking
I'm
about
saying
the
that
criticism.
Right.
Basically, he's saying that most people would not sign up to not be able to express their political opinions. And as a part of a positive example of anarchism that's been, maybe somewhat effective in the modern world, it seems like people are still bending the knee to the authority of the community. So when we were asking hypotheticals earlier in which we were saying, why wouldn't corporatist or private ANCAP societies basically enforce what we would view as currently immoral standards? And you said, oh well, there's competition and they would be able to basically do this or do that or get out of the situation. It seems like there's enough social pressure in this anarchist example that people will just bend the knee in order to survive. And I think this is one of the moral problems that I have that Rob was kind of poking at, which is basically, I think a lot of people will tolerate really awful shit in order to survive. And the more you regionalize these things, I just picture a bunch of miniature fiefdoms of powerful, rich, and influential people who can basically bully everybody else. And when we're really talking about what we're really talking about is the Leviathan, I forget the fucking the author of the book. But what we're talking
Second
about
treatise
is
on government's better.
Okay, but there wasn't there a contemporary piece. So there's the Leviathan, and then there's also who did the Invisible Hand. I forgot. Was that Adam Smith or
Smith,
Thomas
right,
Hobbes
Smith.
or okay?
Yeah.
It was Adam Smith.
So I view these concepts as in the Leviathan and the Invisible Hand. I view them as necessary for each other to maintain each other's health and well-being. I think the Leviathan is necessary to intimidate people into proper action. I think the Invisible Hand is necessary to give people the level of freedom and autonomy and expression that they need to feel like they have fulfilled lives. And I think if you really were to boil down my fear, it's that when you remove the Leviathan, you basically just have chaos. And by the way, I know we're wrapping up on 90 minutes or whatever. I appreciate what you said, where the state can be used in order to make a fight one-sided. But then I'm also asking the question, then how does that not turn everything into a fight? And the only answer I think I've gotten so far is mutually assured destruction.
Before we close the debate up and get into closing statements, and it was very elucidating, I want to give the floor over to last username, as he hasn't had a large amount of time like everybody else has to interact. He seems to have been very reflective for a lot of the debate. Sometimes that's maybe the best way to be, and that's when you really can pummel them back near the end. You know what I mean? But But go ahead, man. You have the floor before we get into
Yeah, I
closing
agree.
statements because we are.
I
about
let him talk a
90
lot in the
minutes
beginning
we
and
have
answer a
ton
lot of
Q&A.
questions.
Go
but-
ahead.
I mean, there was a lot just said there. There was a lot talking about societies that are not anarcho-capitalist. So I don't understand why we're even talking about that. I don't have much to say about them because it's not the kind of society I advocate for. That's why I was not saying much. As far as
Well,
like
I think so. Just to just kind of bring this in, so I understand the kind of the conflict here is like from the ANCAP side, they're like, look, you're not actually engaging with the society that we're talking about. We're talking about an ANCAP
Right.
society. We're talking about an ANCAP society when it comes to police. You're talking about all kinds of other shit that has nothing to do with that. But I do understand kind of the critique from the other side, which is saying, listen, that's not the fucking society we live in. And so all I can do is compare the society that I live in to the society that you're advocating for. And I do find that to be fair game. And I do think that that's a reasonable way to engage with your worldview. How else could you do it?
that is precisely what I do. I compare the society we live in to the one that I would predict would emerge without a state, and the one without a state seems to improve on many of the things that exist in the current society. You know, I hear Connor talking about having how it would be bad to have a bunch of private enclaves controlled by like central dictatorial powers, which is exactly the situation we have now in the world, exactly the thing that I don't like and want to get rid of. He's talking about the invisible hand needs the Leviathan to control it, but that's not what the invisible hand is. The whole point is that it's invisible. The point of the invisible hand is that the market somehow manages to make good decisions without anyone making those decisions. So I'm not hearing a lot of, it doesn't seem like you guys are making really a good faith attempt to understand what we're saying and to engage with it. It seems like you just you're telling us what we're saying and then telling us why it's terrible, and you're not really engaging with what we're saying. I don't. Yeah, that's what.
Can I ask you real quick? I swear this is just a real quick question. What would force in your system for it to be anarcho-capitalist as opposed to anarcho-communal?
What would? Can you say that again?
What do you mean by
Right. What would force? I mean,
What
if we
would
got rid of
force?
the state, right? If we got rid of the state, we could see one example that anarchists point to in Mexico. It became anarcho-communal, and you're saying, no, that's not what we want. We want anarcho-capitalism. Okay, once there's no more state, there's no force.
I
So
think
why would people decide to go the
Sure, yeah,
anarcho-capitalist route instead of the anarcho-communal?
I don't think people would decide anything. Anarcho-capitalism is what I predict would happen without a state. If you want to start an anarcho-communist society, go right ahead, because all you're going to do is get rid of the state, and then we're going to have anarcho-capitalism. Like, you can call it whatever you want.
But my question is, why, if that organically would transition, why didn't it happen in Sharon? Why did they decide to be communal?
I mean, I don't know much about Sharon, but it's a tiny, tiny place with very specific circumstances. So, they're talking like 18,000
I think it's because
people,
inevitably people understand that there are certain
and they
things that
exist
need to come together for.
exist in a state, right? So, I mean, at some level, there is state influence on them, even if they have their own laws and such. It's not.
That's my point.
I don't think
Right.
Sharon is
Your point
really
is the
useful
state exists, so
empirical
therefore
evidence
it
of
will always
anything
exist?
related to what we're talking about.
My point is, even attempts to leave the state, just replace it with something that basically fits in with what the state is, and except it exacerbates the problems that you're complaining about the state with.
So Chiron exacerbated the problems, or I don't understand.
Well, it certainly wouldn't be possible to live in a situation that was high population density or with modern times, and it would cause problems like the enclaves and things like that I was talking about.
Well,
And if
I mean,
more
what I'm
places
just saying, you're
decided-
saying you said it increases the problems, but all of the data
Yes.
shows that it didn't.
Right. So now you're defending Sharon, right? So when we talked about the problem, we could talk about all the problems
Yeah,
with Sharon.
I'm an
and why
anarchist
that situation
first
was-
and an anarcho-capitalist
Right.
second. The
Right, and
debate
so-
is about stateless and more so from an anarcho-capitalist perspective, stateless
Sure.
policing, and to a
Sure.
small degree the judicial systems that go in it. If you want to have a debate about Chiron, like, we could totally schedule something at some point, but it's not really what we're talking about. I just don't want you to say that Chiron made the situation worse when it clearly made the situation better.
The point is, when we're talking about the specifics of things, and I talk about that, and your deflect from that is we're advocating something different, not that, right? And then when I say, well, what
I
would
didn't
stop
deflect.
that sort
You
of
brought
thing
up
from occurring?
Chiron, so I decided to engage
Again,
with it a little
I
bit.
talked about the problems that we saw unique with Chiron right? The enclavism. You're the one who dismissed. No one would come together and have these little enclaves and things like that. That wouldn't happen. I talked about how that was not actually maximizing individuality. That was eliminating individuality even more. And my point, when you deflected and said, well, that's different, we want something different, I'm just asking the question.
Why are you doing this in such bad faith? I don't understand.
Why is this bad faith? I don't understand. Like, you seem to do an awful lot of whining, right? Like, and this, we'll get to it in closing statements. I know. No,
I'm just like, I don't understand. Like, you're arguing with a wall.
I think you're bad faith for accusing me of being bad faith.
No, you brought up,
make it better?
You brought up Tehran, right? And I'm like, cool, I will engage with that, even though that's not what I'm arguing for. And then you make claims based off of Tehran. You want to link me to Tehran. And I'm just like, no, you brought it up, so I engage with it. And if you say shit that's just factually incorrect, Scott, I'm just letting you know.
Stop really quick. And Andrew, stop me if I'm wrong here. But you guys keep saying every time that they try and bring up an example in order to interact with your system that has never been done in history, that you just say that's not the system I'm talking about.
Well, no, I gave a historical example.
When have we said that?
Called Rob.
No, I was
only this Tehran thing.
Pedro, I have to kind of disagree with you a little bit there. So I think what happens as an inevitability in these types of debates too is, like, take CounterPoints for instance. He's a law enforcement officer, or was for many years, right? And he's worked within the system. So what is he going to compare to their system? He's going to compare the system that he knows to the system that they're advocating for. And this is how discourse is done with these different ideas. And I think what the frustration level comes in for the ANCAPs and for the non-ANCAPs together is that they're both trying to draw. The ANCAPs become frustrated. They're like, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this. And the non-ANCAPs are like, yeah, but I'm drawing from the system that I know. So it's hard to engage with this thing that you're advocating for. So I don't think it's as cut and dry quite as the non-ANCAPs are saying. I do see the point on both ends. I think it's just hard to engage. I think for right-wingers especially, for the left in the ANCAPs, I think it's far easier than the right in the ANCAPs, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, they just call me a Nazi.
But this is how I see it. I love this type of discourse. I think it's good. I do think it's very good to begin to merge these together. I'm going to let you guys go for another 10 minutes before we close the statements up. We'll start with CounterPoints. Go ahead, CounterPoints.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I was going to say, if is this closing or just trying to re-engage?
No. Re-engage. You can re-engage for another 10 minutes.
Okay, I'd say before we go, so I'm happy to engage with any example that you guys provide. Every example, every question you've had, I could engage with. It's hard to do that when we've got 4 people discussing and you guys give me like 10 questions at once, right?
So I kind of want to point out. Yeah, I want to point out the if I was trying to save
Andrew's
a baby from the house fire, and can you guys still hear me? Okay, yeah, okay, cool.
Baby from a house fire.
Yeah, so the baby that I'm trying to pull out of the house fire is the fact that the state can put its will behind a certain security apparatus in order to make it a one-sided fight, and as a result, it can enforce like really negative shit that I think we all agree is bad. And maybe if it was an even playing field in which more people could engage force without that monopolization, maybe mutually assured destruction or negotiated reality, like union workers. Like, no offense, probably the reason why the Pinkertons were able to go in and beat the shit out of a bunch of union workers is because the union workers knew that if they beat the shit out of the Pinkertons, then the cops would show up and they would get their asses kicked even harder. So It was the authority of the state that made the private security thing even worse than it already was. I do understand that, and that's the baby that I'm pulling from the house fire. The problem that I'm having, though, is that, like, for me, it just feels like, I don't know if you guys remember that meme, but there's like a person sitting in a church pew, and there's somebody pointing a gun at the back of his head, and there's somebody pointing a gun at the back of their head, and then there's a sniper in the balcony that's pointing at that person, and it just kind of feels like that all over the place. And I do understand that that's kind of what flattened hierarchy for power is, but it just feels like a discordant, schizophrenic, constantly chaotic, constantly in flux society, which you guys seem okay with because you admire the creativity that comes from that anarchy. So I appreciate that.
I think
what feels like that? I don't know what feels like.
No, I kind of get where you're going from with that, right?
Anarchist society feels like that to me.
I think
you live in an anarchist society.
I kind of see where he's going with this, right? And so what I think is terrifying sometimes about the idea of anarcho-capitalism is the lack of central planning. right? Except the thing that always gets me is that they go, well, you know, we have this apparatus, we vote on it, we put people like with republicanism, right? Republics, right? We put people in charge that we, you know, that we think are better qualified to understand how to rule this situation and mostly agree with us. And we come to some sort of consensus and we maintain a certain level of order there, right? And what you see is like all of these different companies and people and all this different stuff involved. And you're like, how does order form from that so that we can ensure a stable and safe society instead of all of this kind of chaotic shit everywhere that I can't keep up with? And you know, Rob Noer talked about this. It's like I go to one town and then I drive my car to the next town and there's new rules in this town. And it's like this, it seems so fucking ridiculous, right? And what I think what's really interesting
the Leviathan is not a Leviathan.
But what I want to pull apart is that right wingers, I love you guys, right? Because you're almost at that position. Stop thinking about that with policing and start thinking about that with all of the other things that the market does that we don't want the state doing. Think about it with healthcare, right? It's they want the state to control healthcare. And then all of us, the lefties are like, yeah, but once the government controls healthcare, it'll be cheaper and it'll be better. And healthcare will be, you know, we'll have healthcare for all and it'll solve all these problems. And you look at that and you go, no, it fucking won't. Like healthcare will be trash because the fucking government is running healthcare and the prices will go up and we'll be waiting in lines for procedures and things like that. And all we're talking about is not as radical as you think. We're just talking about bringing that to policing. A free market of competition.
Listen, real quick. It's definitely as radical as we think, right? And there is something different, unique with talking about something like healthcare, with talking about that we have a code of laws as a group of people that have came together as a nation, and we say that we allow the state to enforce these laws. That's completely different than something like healthcare. And again, I think that the solution that you're offering just exacerbates the problems you're talking about. Let me give an example that hopefully will clear this up, right? I was going to talk state to state, but are you aware of the fact that there's like tribal laws in certain parts of the United States, right?
Yeah,
I think in Wyoming.
Where? I mean, I don't know what they all are, but yeah.
Right. But there's certain jurisdictions that the actual enforcement mechanisms of sort of the state police or whatever have no authority if it occurs on tribal land.
Right, or it's like limited or like they can chase people in or whatever, but they can't.
Right.
Like,
so a lot of these places, the murder rates occurring on those tribal lands are through the roof, as are rape rates and things like that. Because what happens is people from outside of there go in, commit crimes on those lands, and then leave. And it's almost impossible because we have these two separate judicial systems for them to track down the people that came in from the outside and committed these heinous crimes. Now that's just two systems. That's the United States system, the system in the states there, and then the tribal system that's external to that. Now imagine that hundreds of thousands of times over.
Can I ask a quick question?
That you're relying.
It's not really two independent systems, though.
Right.
It's one system that says we're not going to do anything in this little area, and then the little area has to fend for themselves.
Now I'm not sure where you're drawing you made an argument there and you haven't supported it, and maybe you have support for it, and I'd love to read that if you have like research or anything. Do you have like any research, and I promise you I'll look into it, that shows that the reason why crime is so high in these communities is because of the fact that criminals are going in, committing crime, and then escaping? Because most of the stuff that I've read, I haven't read anything recently, but most of the stuff that I've read has talked about socioeconomic status, poor education systems, et cetera, et cetera. I have not seen any study that shows that the reason crime and rape is so high in many of these tribal communities is because criminals from America are going into tribal communities to commit crime and are escaping the judicial system of America.
I don't have the evidence in front of me, but I have read that evidence. But it logically makes sense, anyways. And again,
I don't think it does. I think socioeconomic status and poor education,
and I'll show you how it logically makes sense. Right? Let's say that there's a business dispute between me and for a company in the United States and a company in Canada. Is that harder to solve legally than it would be from two companies in the same jurisdiction?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Right. If we have a business disagreement and that requires some sort of arbitration from a company from the United States versus a company from Canada, is that more difficult to resolve than two companies in the United States?
Yeah, presumably. Yeah, of course.
Okay. Now imagine that 10,000 times over.
But that's not what we're advocating for.
Yes, it is.
No, because the company in America, the company in America, you gave me an analogy, and I'm going to answer it. The company in America has an entirely different system of laws, and then the company of Canada has an entirely different system of laws, and they have to go by that monopolistic tendencies of those laws, and they have to deal with international laws. And what we're advocating for is that companies represent them in their rights enforcement agencies and things of that nature. And so we're arguing that the market would actually be more effective at providing between disputes on borders and things like that.
But it
less
wouldn't,
effective.
because each
Well,
because
why
each,
did you say it
Rob,
would be 10,000
hang
times
on,
over?
guys. I'm sorry. Rob, I'm going to give you the last word. We've got to get into closing statements after that. We've
course.
got a ton of questions. Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, I'll just be real quick. But the problem
Yes,
is
that
each
is a
of the
real-
specific laws, like it's one thing if we're talking about like I literally went into your company and beat up someone that was there, but we're talking about complicated matters of who has rights to drill here, or who has rights to use this land, or who has rights to this sort of technology or property, you know, and things like that. These disputes will become very complicated, and if there's not a universal agreed upon set of laws and an enforcement mechanism, instead we're saying basically, hey, y'all solve it for yourself. Like inevitably this will lead to disputes, and it will lead to worse off things like violence, which we've seen in the past, and we can see that these disputes are more complicated when there's varying legal systems now. So imagine that was everyone got their own legal system based on who they were paying the most for. It would be a disaster.
And then your last rebuttal before we get into closings. Go ahead, guys.
Like closing statements, or
No. Before we get into closing statements, I'm going to let the ANCAP go ahead and rebuttal.
I'm
what
fine.
you
If
just
last
said.
username wants to do it, I can address it in closing. So we have like an absurd amount of time for closing, so it's fine.
Well, okay. I mean, you mentioned like, what about a dispute across America and Canada?
We can't
There's
ask
going to be
questions.
some overhead in resolving that dispute because you have to go across the border. I don't know why you think that would be worse in a society where those boundaries were on a much smaller scale. We expect it to be much
Castle Rock,
better.
is that the one where they
There
don't have a
wouldn't be as
duty to
much
protect?
inefficiency because you have those. So it's still just one boundary that you're crossing, and that's a much more common situation, right? So it's going to optimize for that situation. The fact that
I had that written down
nations,
for my closing.
that most business is done domestically within a nation actually means that the system doesn't handle so well going across borders. But when everyone's resolving disputes across borders, and most people are resolving disputes across borders, there's no reason you can't optimize for that, right? So I don't think it would be 10,000 times worse. I think it would be better.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much. It was a spirited debate. I understand anytime you do a 2-on-2, nobody ever feels like they got enough time to talk. We're going to make sure that we have a nice long closing statement for every person before we get to the Q&A. And boy, do we have a hell of a Q&A. Before we do that, though, last username, I would like to invite you back for a one-on-one with our in-house left-wing debater who would love to take you on your ANCAP stances. His name is Synth. I think that would be a very enjoyable
Do
debate
not
for
do
you. Now,
Do not
I
do
don't
it.
think that your partner likes the guy very much, but I think he
Yeah.
argues on the Crucible differently than he argues in most places. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get into the closing statements. CounterPoints, we're
not
going to
do
start
it.
with
No.
you. You didn't get a lot of chance in that last rebuttal. Go ahead. You have 7 minutes.
Yeah, I'll try not to use all of it, and I wanted to address a couple of things. So I do think that we did get to the crux of the concern from a statist perspective, is the lack of coherency and order and predictability within an anarchist framework. It does just seem like it would be overly complicated and ultimately unenforceable. And I'm not trying to say that to be mean. I'm saying that because those are my legitimate concerns. And then when I was mentioning the invisible hand and the Leviathan, I wasn't saying that these
Trans
things
girl?
were
No.
operating in
I
concert
mean, maybe.
or they're the
I
same
don't think
thing.
so.
I understand their contradictory perspectives, but I think the tension between the two creates opportunity for everyone. What I mean by that is that the Leviathan, basically the representative of state power that intimidates people in order to not murder as much, not steal as much, not rape as much, not be as
Casimir, I
immoral
was
or
going to talk
amoral.
about it.
That can be a powerful
I wasn't going to go into details of the case, but I might now that I think about it.
correctly. And the fear of reprisal from the state can basically force people to act morally better than they would otherwise. And then the invisible hand being the way in which the market and people negotiate reality can kind of give you that freedom. So I don't want purely a Leviathan society, and I don't want purely an invisible hand society. I want the tension between the two, and I actually think that liberal democracies and Western republics do a goddamn great job of this. When we're looking at the free world kind of coming together in order to tell, Putin to go fuck himself when he's invading another sovereign nation, I think
Some of us are. Some of us are.
Okay,
Leo, go
just
ahead.
me. Just me. So basically, you can kind of see what actual violence, what actual war, what actual dictatorship, what actual intimidation of freedom of speech looks like, because I think we have it comparatively nice in the Western world, in the European world, in the American and Canadian world. So when we talk about these problems, people getting the shit kicked out of them. When we're talking about, the overreaches of the American state and all that kind of shit, I think we forget that we have like a homicide. Everybody has guns in the United States. We have a homicide rate of 5 per 100,000. You go down to Mexico or Central America, there's some countries that have 20 per 100,000 or 50 per 100,000, depending on the country. We live in a pretty free and safe society, even if it doesn't feel like it. And then when we talk about like economic mobility, there's a whole bunch of fucking problems that we have because of corporate capture and because of the way our corporations and our state work together. But the truth is, if you work your dick off, you can actually make an okay living compared to at least medieval standards, if not modern standards. So I am sympathetic to the problems that you guys have brought up. I don't want to jump out of the frying pan and into the fire. And if my skepticism feels like that's where it's coming from, that is where it's coming from. I have to know demonstrably that your alternative system is better than the status quo for me to advocate for it, even hypothetically. And there's little historical, I'll wrap this up in a second, there's little historical finesses that I think have to be acknowledged. So for instance, you were talking about like an Italian mercantile anarchist state that existed between the papal states and the other mercantile states of Italy for 400 years. That's impressive. That's awesome. It's badass, and God bless those people. But I think that historically, probably what allowed them to exist was, one, Italy being incredibly mercantile and trade-based, two, having powerful neighbors, and three, those powerful neighbors being willing to kick the shit out of anybody else who was trying to invade Italy. So that's where I think that anarchism has to contend with the existence of exterior states that can always come and kick your shit in. And until like you create universal human consciousness that reviles the state to the point that every human being wants to be an anarchist, I think for me it will remain a utopian fantasy. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Counterpoints, thank you so much for your closing statement. By the way, anybody who has not liked and subscribed to Counterpoints channel, you should do it immediately. He's a great faith debater. Right? He's one of the best who's out there on the right-wing side. He's a friend of the Crucible. We always appreciate him coming on, even though he didn't come on camera tonight like a fuckhead. But we're going to forgive him because he did show up to the debate, even though he has a million things going on. I'm going to give this over to the ANCAP side. Let's start with you, Scott. Go ahead with your closing.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so, what we saw tonight, I don't want to characterize it as bad faith. I said a few times that it felt like bad faith, but in the spirit of peace and negotiation with you guys, God, it's a breath of fresh air sometimes to debate you guys instead of being screamed at by lefties that just pretend like everything I said I didn't say. But it's difficult to have these conversations and things of that nature because, the violence of the state is a reality, and the violence under anarchism is conjectural. It's theoretical, right? Because of all the anarchist societies that have existed, they've been small scale and predominantly far less violent than any other state-based system. And we have all of these examples of the violence of the state, but of course you have to engage with these what ifs, right? You have to understand. I do appreciate that CounterPoints in his closing statement especially, tried to understand what it was. But the thing that I thought was so interesting is that he said, I like this idea of the state and the market kind of working together, this mixed economy where the Leviathan has some control and some reins and things of that nature. And so I would simply ask this, why not I ask for the same compromise that socialists ask for sometimes in healthcare? that I ask for in policing in the opposite direction, which is if you want to see that try and work out, if you want to see these things in practice, why not give people the right of certain policing within local communities if they so vote to do so? If certain localities vote to have their sheriff's office or things of that nature be privatized, and we still have state police that oversee those things, would we not be able to have this beautiful system of federalism that we have be a laboratory to see if maybe we are right, that maybe a competition of police forces in communities could be a more effective form of policing than a pure monopolistic tendencies that the state has? And if we prove those things to be correct, maybe we can go from there, and you won't have to think about theoretical examples. We can have the freedom and the beauty of the things that we want now, and if it doesn't fucking work out, send in the Mounties and the state police and say, hey, this fucking experiment failed, and here's the proof that it fucking failed. Give us the freedom to choose. But currently we don't have that freedom to choose. And America is a unique example, like CounterPoint said, of how great policing can be despite all of its horrible forms of oppression, right? You know, Australia, UK, Canada, these are systems that were once hailed as just as good, if not better than ours. And yet what do we see? We see that the state slowly gains in power, especially as left-wing individuals of authoritarian nature want to give more and more power to the state. And what you see is people being locked up in prison because they're a grandma that posted a sticker on a telephone pole in the UK, and she was locked in prison for over 8 hours and released on the side of the road at 2 a.m. because she dared put up a sticker that said that we need to look at domestic violence against women because the police thought that was transphobia. And then they invaded her home and they looked until they found college texts that they considered to be TERF, which is something that is not allowed, trans exclusionary radical feminism. And they stole her books because they're banned books until the investigation is complete. This is what happens when you have a monopoly of power and violence, is that so long as the government is doing its job and everything is stable, it seems okay, especially from people in positions of privilege like here in America or in wealthier neighborhoods. But there are people living in poor communities today that call the police. I was one of those people where I called the police because my neighbor was being shot at and their home was being sprayed with bullets. And the police said, yeah, we don't go to that neighborhood at night because it's in a bad neighborhood. So this fantasy that it is only the anarcho-capitalist system that could magically create a two-tiered system of justice because of policing issues is one that we live under today. And I'm simply asking for the freedom to be able to experiment with these ideas so you can see that our system really is better. So give us that freedom. Lastly, Castle Rock v. Gonzalez and Warren v. DC have shown that police don't have a duty to protect you. The police are not actually forced to protect you or protect your rights if they feel that they might be in danger in some capacity or they simply don't want to. And what we're talking about is rights enforcement agencies that are paid for the very thing of doing rights. It is, Robert Peel in 1829 set up these systems of what modern policing would look like. And one of the things that really jumps off is his 9th principle of policing, which is that police efficiency is absence of crime and disorder, not action. And what we have is a corrupt state system of policing where money and politicians and drug busts and the war on crime and arrests are how we measure how successful policing is. And what this has done is ravaged poor communities, ravaged minority communities, ravaged Appalachian communities. And instead, if you have a system of business and free enterprise that would be allowed to participate in this system, I think what you would see is a return to policing as an efficiency model based on the absence of crime. And I'll cede my time.
He had 1 minute. That's what the finger was, right? It's like one.
No, I was wrapping up anyways. I was good.
No problem. I wanted to say before I turn it over to Rob Noer, that anybody who has not gone in to FL Scott's Discord, and if he links it to us, we will put it in the description, needs to get in that Discord. It's very good faith people. I appreciate them quite a bit. He has people who come into ours. We have people who go into his. It's kind of an interesting dynamic, and we always like when Scott comes on the Crucible. We consider him a friend of the Crucible. Thank you so much for your closing statement, Scott. Rob, Noer, you're up. Oh, hang on, Rob. Let me unmute you. I'm sorry, I had a little bit of background noise, so I muted you.
Oh, my bad.
Go ahead, man.
Am I good? Okay. So I think fundamentally the problem that we see here is that there's no proven reason for this radical departure. Even in Fabian's closing statement there, he's like, well, why not take a chance? This is the same sort of thing you hear from radical communists. They act like the system is so bad right now, and they're able to correctly point out flaws in the system and bad things in the system. I point them out every day on my show. There are certainly a lot of things. I also sympathize with the idea of wanting small government and smaller government, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a state at all. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have policing that is from the state. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have states that create those laws, that we all have a system of laws that we can see. The foundational, at one point in the opening statements, Fabian was talking about the founding fathers' intent. Clearly, the founding fathers intended for there to be documents showing what our rights and our laws were. That's why they created them. They didn't create an anarchist system. They understood the importance to have a country. They understood the ability to have a military. They understand the importance of having policing and these laws being written down. The problem is, just like the no real communism argument, what you see through these debates is we'll say, well, here are the logical bad things that would happen under your system. And they just say, no, they won't happen. And let me explain why. I could do the same thing, right? I could say, no, my version of having a state would solve all the problems you're talking about. And be able to given
communism a lot of troubles, right?
The game there at the end, he says the problems in the state system we could see, but because the system they're advocating for has never been tried, all of the problems are theoretical. But you could do this with anything. The reason that his system hasn't been tried, or both of their
discourse, we obviously disagree,
is because it's not practical, because it's not able to be enforced in the real world. That inevitably people will realize
still work with you to destroy the state if you'll work with me.
There is no law.
Just know I don't trust you because you're a goddamn commie.
And you pay for private security firms to enforce those laws. It's different from town to town, whatever people want. Inevitably, people will collectively come together and say, no, we need to collectivize in some way and have some sort of system of laws that are predictable and things like that, which is just tantamount to replacing the state with another actor that functionally is the same as the state. What is it that exactly they're complaining about that they want to get rid of the state? Taxes, being theft and things like that. I agree there's far too much taxation, but the government should exist and the state should exist. And some of the fundamental things should be protection in the form of policing and the military. And then simple things like infrastructure and things like that, that are well over expounded what we consider infrastructure. But those are the fundamental basis of what state should be and what government should be. That sort of stuff's
I know that's the funniest shit I've ever heard.
That's why anarcho-capitalism didn't appear more readily. And again, Connor does a great job of arguing against this one mercantile system. It's just not possible in today's world. It's so complicated. Who would control all of the infrastructure? Who controls the electric grid? Who controls the water system? And when there are disputes, when someone says, no, I have claims to that as a private business owner, I have claims to the water system, I have claims to the electric grid, who resolves those disputes? And we've gone through a litany of reasons.
And this is why we call conservatives socialists.
So it's basically, and
just
then
just
they say
taxation,
military. Well, basically under their system, you still
common
have
sense
to pay
rules
for
on our
protection.
economy.
So it might not be in the
tariffs.
form of taxation, but you have to pay as you need the services.
Oh, and
there's all sorts of terrible things that we've already
Christian
gone through,
fifis don't
enclaves that would come about where people say we have specific sets of rules where we live here, and it could be really insane, perverse things like we only want people of a certain ethnicity.
We just want a 34% tax, not a 37% tax. Aren't we better?
People of a certain religion. I can imagine a society, and like we to see where Fabian's accurately talking about a lot of the problems we have in today's system. For example, he talks about people being abused by the state for apparently being transphobic. Well, what this shows is it proves that when they say that these things would solve themselves because enough people would be upset externally, then why weren't they enough people upset externally in Canada to be able to prevent that? Right? The only chance you have is if people are upset externally enough to have some sort of movement or voting to be able to change the system. To the degree that they're not, these sorts of things would happen and be more likely to happen when they're more localized and you have people that are only affected in small ways that would be able to notice it. look at insurance companies now. There are all sorts of people that are abused by the insurance company, but individuals don't really have the power to stand up to them that great. If we gave all of the power to literally insurance companies and mercenaries that we're paying, they could abuse individuals all the time. And unless that individual was able to find the financial resources or someone with a big enough voice to convince one of these insurance groups to go along with them, then they would just be shit out of luck. And the reality is this system isn't perfect, but the radical departure that they're talking about would be a disaster. No, we don't just radically destroy the state and say we no longer have the United States of America because you could point to some abuses. The reality is we have it so lucky, even with all the bad things that we should be striving against in the United States. This is the greatest country in the history of the world. And by metric of being alive today in the United States, we are amongst the luckiest people that ever existed. To act like it's so miserable that we need to throw out the entire state and any hypothetical that you could come up with like logical things, well, wait a minute, this would cause all sorts of problems, just to go, no, we don't think so. We assume that everyone would be benevolent and there would be external factors and no one would do these sorts of things. I just think that it's childish. It's not practical. And even in the systems where they could say that it theoretically happened one time in a mercantile system, which Connor already gave arguments as to why that wasn't the best example or why there were external factors that were unique to allow that to happen, it certainly wouldn't work in an area as big as the United States with a technologically advanced area like the United States that we see today. It just wouldn't work. He says, why not give privatization of local police now or local areas? But that would still be backed by the state. Your argument isn't just, well, we allow people to enforce the laws of the state, but allow private mercenaries to do that. That's not your argument. Even that would be backed by the state. So it's interesting. That's something that maybe we can talk about, but not really the topic at hand. So I just think at the end of the day that you can see it's very similar to debating communists where it's always, that's not true communism. My specific version of what anarcho-capitalism solves all problems. There's
don't
no
forget
criticism
about
that you could levy
not
because
just
I could always say,
starving,
if you just
but
give me time to
people
explain,
pissing
we
and
can explain
shitting
to you
them.
by
Actually, hold on,
what
Futures
they
Anarchy.
The
I got
reality
something
is
for you.
this system is impossible to enact. That's why we have
I got a little present for you.
And even if one did, if the entire world doesn't do it at the same time, it would be overwhelmed as soon as a country got resource poor or needed to boost their economy because they would come in and take these resources. It would be a disaster. It would lead to all sorts of violence. It would lead to vigilantism. It would lead to mob justice. And it would be an absolute disgrace to throw away the greatest country in the history of the world based on these frivolous Hail Mary attempts that say we assume everything will be basically utopian if we adapt it.
Yeah, no, I was just showing you we got shit in chat for that. People come in and say Trump.
Ronald Reagan.
I will do this. I will figure this out.
I hope the prices on the food goes down though, Rob. You know, I really do. I hope the prices on food go down. I've got all the little ones, you know. I've got all the little ones. Rob Noer, always been a friend to the channel. A wonderful debater. He's the best on the right, in my opinion. And those trenches, though, Rob, they've been quite empty, haven't they? Quite empty, those trenches. I'm going to move on from Rob. We're going to get on to last.
No human is irredeemable.
Closing statements. Take your time, last username. It has been a pleasure to have you on.
We don't have the right
very much about you, but I found your debate style to be very eloquent.
No human is irredeemable, I think.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. So I still don't feel like I've really been able to explain, or we've been able to explain, how an anarcho-capitalist society would work in detail. And perhaps that's just a limitation of the debate format. I can't help but feel that our opponents weren't trying as hard as they could to actually understand it, but maybe I'll take some of the blame too. So if you want to learn, if you do want to learn how an anarcho state or a stateless society would work, I would encourage you to go and find out. One way you could do that.
I'll bite that bullet.
Of course, following my Twitch and
no human is irredeemable, even Hitler.
All the time. But actually, if you want to go straight to the source, there's, in my opinion, one sort of high-profile ANCAP who's actually explaining this stuff in detail. The only one. His name is David D. Friedman. He wrote a book called The Machinery of Freedom, which actually explains in pretty much in quite a lot of detail how this side would work, and probably answers all of the questions that you have. I think it answers all the
should have just let him in art school, but he was a shitty painter.
And so if you really want to understand this, then go read that book, or just search for his name on YouTube. Made lots of videos and stuff explaining it in more concise format. When you argue that anarchy can't work, anarchy just means no state. And literally, that's all that I'm talking about. Anarcho-capitalism just means don't change the way society works. Society is mostly working the way it should work, with markets organizing things. And there's just a few specific things that the state still does. And all I'm advocating for is to get rid of the state. Don't let the state monopolize those few particular industries. Allow those industries to also work the way everything else already works. My empirical evidence for that is just that everything else already works better than the state at doing all those other things. So let's use that better system to do the last remaining things. When you argue that that can't work, what you're saying essentially is that the state, the way the state does it, is the only way it can be done. There is no other possible way we could have a justice system or an education system or defense system or whatever. And that's a really, really ambitious argument, right? It's one thing to say this particular way of doing it doesn't work. It's very bold to say that this is the only way it could be done, and every other possible way would be worse or not work at all. You're really claiming that you have this sort of unlimited imagination, that you've thought of every possible
I'm
way
not saying
done,
let him
and check,
go
none of them
fucking
work.
free. I'm
I
just
don't
saying he's
think
not irredeemable.
Anybody has actually done that. I think the best you can say, if you're being honest, is I can't imagine another way that this could work. And that is perfectly reasonable. Most people cannot imagine how these things could be done. Most people can't imagine how most things could be done. Things are really complicated and hard to do. But if that's your approach, then you should at least be open. Hey, has anybody else been able to think of ways that this could be done? Before I say it's impossible, let me at least go find other people who might have come up with ways that this could be done, that we could have a stateless, that we could have a market justice system, and check it out and see if what they're describing seems to work. I did that, and I think what they're describing does seem to work. So if you really want to engage with this in good faith, I think you should do the same thing. Why hasn't it been tried before? That's been brought up a few times. It's a reasonable argument. If this is a good idea, why don't we see any anarchies so far? The counter argument to that is that there have been many innovations in social organization that didn't happen for a long time throughout history, and then eventually they did, right?
Right.
We didn't have capitalism for a long time, and then we did. We didn't have democracy for a long time, and then we did, right? All sorts of things. So to say that because something has never happened, it's a bad idea, we've had many counterexamples of that, right? Many good ideas that didn't happen for a long time, and then eventually they did. It's just a matter of technology. We have to actually invent these ways of organizing society. We don't have to do this all at once.
God, I love
That's
that
a straw man. I never said that. We can incrementally try little bits of opening up the justice system to more private competitive involvement. Give people a little more leeway to enforce their own rights or to arbitrate their own disputes, which they can then delegate to.
That's what I was saying. Give me the freedom to try it out in a small town.
Take a leap of faith. We can just try it incrementally. I don't see how you can argue against that. Why not give it a try? And this idea that the state is, we tend to perceive the state as this one powerful entity that fixes things, and the absence of a state would therefore be more complicated. But remember, the state is made of thousands, millions of people who are all pursuing their own interests in an elaborate network of incentives. They're negotiating with each other, they're competing, they're, all of the things that you think make a market so complex actually makes a state complex too. It's a really complex system with lots of self-interested people competing, stabbing each other in the back. The thing with the guns pointed at each other. Yeah, we have that situation too. You can't avoid that, right? Society is always a complex network of people.
Yeah, I'm glad he went last.
I think there's a better structure for that network of incentives than what we have with the state. And that's all I'm proposing. All right, that's enough for me.
You just watched a clip from our Twitch channel, Fabian Liberty. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe here on YouTube, or go ahead and give us a follow on twitch.tv/Fabian Liberty.